So welcome to MPO 101 for CAMPO. If you're here, you're probably a TCC member or an executive board member or alternate or another staff person who might work on or with MPO stuff. So this training is meant to be a pretty high level overview of what we do, what some of our programs and processes are, and how you can stay plugged in and get kind of the most out of your MPO membership. One of the benefits we think to doing this training is that people can get to see each other and get to know each other. We haven't had much of that over the past couple of years, particularly with our TCC, which is a large group. We haven't had an in-person TCC meeting in 3 years now. So we have a lot of TCC turnover where people haven't even met each other and we haven't met people and haven't seen people in real life. So I'm Shelby Powell, one of the 2 deputy directors here at CAMPO. This is Alex Rickard, the other deputy director, and Chris Lucasina, our executive director. And we have a couple other CAMPO staff sprinkled throughout and online. So what I'd like to do first is we'll go around the room and introduce yourselves and just kind of tell us how you're involved with the MPO, and then we'll attempt to do that with our online folks as well. So Het, you want to start?
Yeah, Het Patel, City of Raleigh Transportation Transit, Bus Rapid Transit Team, involved with the MPO from a TPAC, Transit Planning Advisory Committee perspective.
Chandler Hagan with CAMPO, the lab manager.
I'm Delia Chi. I'm with Raleigh-Durham Airport Authority. I am the alternate for our CEO, Michael Languth, on the TCC.
Hello, I'm Kara Russell. I'm with City of Raleigh, also on the Bus Rapid Transit team.
I'm Kim Nguyen. I'm with NCDOT with the Integrated Mobility Division.
Patrick Pierce, Economic Development Director of the Town of Clayton and an alternate on TCC.
Austin Stanion, Technology and Service Planning for Go Triangle.
Barbara Godwin, I'm with the City of Raleigh's Transportation Department over in our Bike and Pedestrian Group.
Jason Myers, City of Raleigh Transportation Department in the Strategy Group.
Renee Austin,
Captain Jacobs, Town of Holly Springs. We handle development services and the engineering group.
Aaron Pritchard, Senior Long Range Planner, Town of Holly Springs. I work closely with Daniel here, who is our rep for the town. He's our transportation planner. Over to you.
Oh, I'm Daniel Stroll. I'm the transportation planner for the Town of Holly Springs, and I'm the TCC primary.
Jason Brown, Development Services Director for the Town of Knightdale.
Jessica Day, board member as well, mayor for the Town of Knightdale.
Andrew Spiliotis, TCC rep, Town of Knightdale.
Ben McDonald, Mayor Pro Tem, Town of Knightdale, TCC alternate, or board alternate.
All right, thank you. And oh, I'm sorry, somebody else walked in.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Fabian Rodriguez with the Town of Cary, Transit Public Engagement Coordinator.
Great, good to meet you. So now I want to go through our people online. I'm going to attempt to just go down the list here that we have, and if you can unmute yourself and just give a brief introduction so we know who's online. We'll start with Amanda.
Hello, I'm Amanda Simmons, the Transportation Planner at NC State.
Great, thank you. Chris Hills.
Good morning, everybody. Chris Hills, Development Services Director for the Town of Holly Springs. Lots of awesome people in the room, so it's good to see everybody again.
And Dr. Mary Young. Okay, Elizabeth Goodson.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth, and I'm with Holly Springs as well, Land Development Division Manager.
Thank you. Phil Geary.
Hi, Phil Gary, NCDOT Transportation Planning Division.
Thanks, Phil. Joe Geigley.
Good morning. I'm Joe Geigley. I'm with the Federal Highway Administration. I've got planning responsibilities for both CAMPO and DCHC.
And Glenn York.
Glenn York, the Mayor of Zebulon Executive Board, CAMPO.
Thank you, Mayor. Lee Hines.
Yes, this is Richie Hines. I'm with the DOT. I'm district engineer for Harnett County and Cumberland County.
Great, thanks for being here. Janine Nguira.
Hi, good morning. I'm Janine Nguira, and I am a planner with the town of Wendell.
Great, thank you. Jennifer Delcourt.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Delcourt, and I'm the Safe Routes to School Coordinator for Wake County Health and Human Services.
Thank you. Justin Jorgensen.
Good morning, Justin Jorgensen with the Granville County Planning Department.
And Kenneth Withrow.
Good morning, all. Kenneth Withrow, Senior Transportation Planner with the Capital Area MPO.
Thank you. And Hassan Kingsbury.
Good morning. I'm the town attorney for Wake Forest. Good to be here today.
Thank you. Lisa Blackburn.
Good morning, I'm Lisa Blackburn. I am the Finance Director at CAMPO.
Thank you. Lisa Kirby.
Lisa Kirby, Director of Engineering and City Engineer for the City of Greenville and Chair for our TCC.
Welcome. Thanks for being here. Mike Frangos.
Hello, good morning. Mike Frangos, City of Creedmoor, Community Development Director. I'm here with our city engineer, Carl Faulkner.
All right, thank you. Mike Bruff.
Good morning, Mike Bruff with Cover Demand Modeler with CAMPO.
Thank you. Paul Kingman.
Hi, I'm Paul Kingman with Go Triangle's finance team.
Thank you. And Melanie Roush.
Hey, good morning. I'm Melanie Roush with the City of Raleigh. I am on the bus and bus facilities team, so I have kind of purview over the fixed route part of Go Raleigh.
Thank you. Scott Hammerbacher.
Yes, Scott Harrabacher of Franklin County Planning Inspections.
Thank you. Darius Sturdivant.
Good morning, Darius Sturdivant, NCDOT Division 6 Planning Engineer.
All right, Susan Evans.
Good morning, I'm Susan Evans. I represent Wake County on the CAMPO Executive Board.
Thank you. And William Wood.
Good morning, I'm Bill Wood, Transportation Planner with Wake County Public Schools.
All right, thanks for being here. That was everybody, I think, on the list, unless somebody else joined and popped up further in the list. We also had one more person join us here in the room. I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, Ben Brewster, City of Raleigh, Transit Planner.
Okay, great. So
Excuse
as I
me,
said,
hello, I see Cheryl Stallings is on and she's my alternate from Wake County.
Good morning, everyone.
good morning. Thanks for being here.
Sure.
So as I mentioned, this is a hybrid meeting. So those of you who are in the room, if you have questions, obviously raise your hand and we can answer questions as we go along. If you're online, please feel free to either raise your hand or enter your question into the chat. We'll have people monitoring the chat to be able to answer those questions as well, or we'll stop and discuss as we need to. Just for housekeeping for those in the room, you passed by the restrooms on your way into the office space. So if you walk out the front doors, the restrooms and water fountain are on the left, and elevators are down the hall, and there's a set of stairs should a fire break out just outside of our doors. I think that's all we need housekeeping wise. Feel free to continue to help yourself to snacks and things in the back of the room. And we'll go ahead and get started. Chris?
Good morning, everyone. As we thought about how to do our first hybrid meeting in this room, we realized there isn't a very good place for the podium and the one camera you have in the room. So those of you online, you won't see a lot of the speaker, but you probably are looking at the slides anyway. And for those in the room, hopefully you all can hear us, and don't mind if we sit here, but if that bothers anybody, I'm happy to stand as well. Also, for those in the room, if I can direct your attention to the ceiling here real quick towards the front of the room, you'll see there's one ceiling tile that has a green light on it. That is a microphone. That's how everybody online will be able to hear us. It is a very good microphone. So even if you're in the back of the room, unless you're having at a complete whisper, they will hear you online. We have figured that out. So I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that, in case there's any like trade secrets going on throughout the room. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is introduce everybody to the rest of the CAMPO team. I'm not going to go through every name on these couple of slides, but particularly since Shelby mentioned, a lot of you are newer to CAMPO, even though new in this context is 2 to 3 years, where you may not have actually seen some of the staff that work for you all here at the MPO. So right now we have 17 staff members. We have 3 additional positions that were created in January. They're actually open right now. They close on Thursday. So if you know anybody who's looking for a job at a great place that does a lot of good, fun transportation stuff, point them towards our website. But we have a variety of different skill sets and expertise on staff. Some a little newer in their career, many that have been around in the field for a long time, transportation planners, transportation engineers, travel demand forecast folks, data people, public engagement folks, and of course, financial folks. Several of you, I think, are maybe a little more involved with the Wake Transit end of things than sort of the MPO proper or central other core missions of the MPO. So hopefully, when you see these folks around as time goes on, you'll recognize them at least as, oh, hey, that person works at CAMPO. So we've done our intros. We've covered sort of the logistics. We also wanted to point out that for those of you who are looking for continuing education credit, if you are AICP, there's the information on the screen for you to use to find this and get your credit. And I think this will also be, are we recording this? I think we are, right?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, we are. We're recording this, so you should be able to see it later as well. I see some people taking pictures in the room here, so anyway. So online, just go ahead and hit your raise hand button. And when we get to a point where we can handle the question, we have folks monitoring that, so we will be able to call on you. Those in the room, old fashioned raise your hand and flag us down, and we'll go ahead and answer those questions. There'll be a couple of breaks along the way, so don't worry, we're not trapping you in front of your computer or in the room here. So by the end of this, hopefully you'll have an understanding of what CAMPO is, a brief history, why we exist, what we have to do, and then in addition to that, what things that the board has decided we should do or need to do beyond the actual federal requirements. You'll understand the major work products that we are responsible for on all your all's behalfs. We'll talk to you about Wake Transit, as well as a lot of other programs and things that happen here at the MPO. And then hopefully by the end of this, you'll also have a better understanding and of the tools that can help you be successful with CAMPO. So at the dawn of time, MPOs were created. Actually, for, highways is where a lot of this really began. As much as as we strive to be multimodal, the money for transportation really started coming in with highways. And through successive highway acts that made it through Congress, money began to be there for the development of highways and the highway network across the country, which was viewed as the transportation network back then. It wasn't. There was a lot more to it than that, but that was really the focus and where a lot of the money went. So as that was going on, a lot of things were being directed from the federal government to state governments. And, I think over time, folks realized that the voice of locals was missing. And so as time went on and we finally got into the 1960s, this was recognized as a shortfall. And so in 1962, Congress passed the Highway Act of 1962, and that required what is known as the 3C transportation planning process, which is the continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive process. And yes, like all good federal requirements, there is a specific definition of those 3 words. We're not going to go through all that today, but they are defined in regulation. And so this also established metropolitan planning organizations, and those are established for all urbanized areas as defined by the U.S. Census with a population of 50,000 or more. It's a requirement to receive federal funding, not only for the planning and programming processes, but also the federal funding for the construction of the things we're trying to build. So CAMPO began in 1968, but many of the larger MPOs we know today around the country, there's a little over 400 MPOs across the entire country. Really began in the mid to late 60s and into the 1970s. And during the 70s and the 80s, MPOs were still kind of new, getting their footing. In different states, things were handled differently. But in the 1990s, through what really began as a succession of new and additional federal legislation and regulations, the role and the requirements for MPOs grew significantly, right? The money available to MPOs also grew significantly. The same things were happening at the state level. And we're not going to go through every single law and regulation that's up on the screen right now, but it's just meant to have it on in one spot so you all can look at this if you want to later. But today, just understand there's been a long history of laws and regulations and reauthorizations that have occurred to get us to where we're at today. So, in a nutshell, what is an MPO? It's a federally mandated and funded regional organization that is primarily for transportation policy and decision making. It's made up of representatives from local governments. It's made up of representatives from other transportation authorities and agencies at the local, regional, state, and federal level. And our primary role is to conduct that 3C process. So how are MPOs determined? I kind of spoke to that already. Once the census has been conducted every 10 years, the Census Bureau takes a little while, usually about a year or two. This time around, almost 3, to define urbanized areas, right? And again, that's areas that have a population of 50,000 or more end up qualifying to become an MPO. So once this happens, a metropolitan planning area boundary, the MPO's boundary, needs to be created collectively by designation of the governor of the state and agreement of the local governments that represent the population within that urbanized area. So every MPO is that core urbanized area plus the area that is anticipated to urbanize within a 20-year period. Now, if you think about the second part of that for a minute, it can be a little bit of a gray area, right? Because we're kind of forecasting out what areas will urbanize and meet that census definition of urbanized area. So within that definition, those are the areas that we are required to include within the MPO. Each 10 years, we go through a process to review the boundaries based on the latest decennial census. We're going through that process right now. So today, kind of showing you where we're at. On the map here, the white area are the MPO boundaries for CAMPO, which is on the right-hand side of that dark black line, kind of in the middle of the map. And the DCHC MPO, which is one of the other MPOs in North Carolina, is to the left of that. The green area is our core urban area, the Raleigh-Cary urbanized area. And up until the 2020 census, the purple area on the screen, which is the Clayton Archer Lodge urban area, was a part of the Raleigh-Cary urban area. In 2020, the census modified their definition. They tightened up their definition of urbanized area a little bit. So those of you around in 2010 probably remember the hop, skips, and jumps. Those of you who weren't involved in any of this stuff back then are probably like, what do you mean hop, skips, and jumps? But it basically connected the green and the purple into one urbanized area. 2020, those were disconnected. Although I think if they went back out today and looked at what was out there, they would be connected again. So right now, we're going through a process with Clayton, Archer Lodge, and Johnston County to make a determination on whether that purple area will stay within CAMPO as a part of CAMPO, or whether it will become a separate new MPO. And we're gonna figure all that out by June. So stay tuned on that.
Hey, Chris?
Yeah.
Can you tell us if there are other MPOs other than DCHE that are on our borders and what their names are? Just for.
Yeah,
awareness?
I have a map. I'm gonna show you here in just a second. I think we have that map in here. If not, I will answer that question. So each MPO under the federal law has 5 core functions. They're up there on the screen. We establish a fair and impartial setting. So for many of you, that's the TCC or the executive board meetings, right? At a minimum, we actually go a lot more than that. We evaluate transportation alternatives. That's one of the main things we do. We look at what are different ways to meet our needs in the future. We maintain the region's long-range transportation plan that's called the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We develop and maintain the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. And for many of you who have started in transportation and had your careers all in North Carolina, we'll talk more about this in a little bit later, but our region has a TIP. The state has its own TIP known as the STIP. Those are actually 2 separate things in all the regulations and law. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then the 5th thing on here, and it's only 5th because that's the way it's written down in the regs, but I think it's actually a really important one, is involve the public and key affected subgroups and stakeholders. That we spend a lot of time trying to get engagement and involvement in the things that are going on in transportation in our region. So those primary responsibilities, again, the MTP and the TIP. As we go through this presentation, we'll get a little bit deeper into each of these, but high level, the MTP is that regional long range plan. It's got to be at least 20 years out into the future, and we update that every 4 years. It must be fiscally constrained, meaning it's not a wish list. If we put a project in there, we have to show that we have anticipated revenues to pay for it. So that's a huge important thing to remember about the MTP. The TIP, again, we develop a TIP, which is essentially the capital improvement program for our region. It's like your local CIPs, but it's just transportation. And then at the bottom there, one of the things that many areas of the country have to deal with is air quality. And so our area continues to have to deal with air quality conformity. And so we are required to ensure that our region meets air quality conformity requirements. It has gotten a little bit easier in recent years because we don't have to do the full entire process. Our air quality has actually gotten better over time since all this really began in the 90s. And so there's an abbreviated process that still takes time, and it's still something we have to do, but it doesn't take nearly as long to do it. So CAMPO. We cover all of Wake County and portions of Granville, Franklin, Johnston, and Harnett counties. That's 19 municipalities, 5 counties, a population of about 1.4 million, or about 12% of the state's population lives within CAMPO. And that continues to grow. I think right now we are one of the fastest growing MPO populations by actual hard count, not percentage maybe, in the state. So our structure, we have an executive board. That is the decision-making and policy-making board of the MPO. That is, and we'll talk a little bit more about what makes that up in a moment. We also have a technical coordinating committee. That's generally the technical and staff level committee that has representation from all the member agencies. We have a professional full-time staff. And then, of course, we have all of the local jurisdictional boards and councils and bodies that we work with as well. So the executive board is made up of the local government elected officials and appointed officials. We have North Carolina Department of Transportation, well, the North Carolina Board of Transportation, members for each of the 3 NCDOT divisions that CAMPO overlaps with. And then the other agencies that are members of CAMPO have representation as well. Go Triangle, one of their Board of Trustee members sits on our board, as an example. That group meets the third Wednesday of every month at 4 p.m. Those are regularly scheduled meetings. Generally, historically, they have canceled July and December meetings unless there was something really pressing to deal with. The Technical Coordinating Committee, that's the staff level committee that has representation from all of our member agencies, all of our key partner agencies and a few others. They meet the first Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. And they generally follow the same pattern as the executive board. So unless there's pressing matters in July or December, they'll usually cancel those meetings. For your staff, again, you can see a wide variety of focus areas on the staff: transportation planners, engineers, data folks, financial people, public engagement, and transit. Recently, CAMPO's executive board adopted an updated strategic plan that identified several strategic focus areas. Those are on the left-hand side of the screen. And then operational focus areas. So how do we take those things on the left-hand side of the screen and really make something happen, right? And those are on the right-hand side of the screen in the white box there. Are we showing the video? I can't remember.
See if we can.
All right, so we have a little bit of a video here to show you that talks about how land use decision-making and transportation decision-making are connected and intertwined. And we'll try and show that for you here now. If it doesn't work, we'll send the link out in the comments.
Always a fun new challenge.
I think you have to exit out of the thing.
You mean stop sharing?
You want to switch the screen you're sharing, sorry.
You can iron your clothes using ice. Here's how. Brought to you by CAMPO. It's ice. This life hack sounds weird, but it actually.
The mission of the Urban Land Institute is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. ULI Triangle supports this mission through our efforts in education, partnering with local governments and institutions, and through the efforts of our members in research and developing ideas around land use and building community. There are rules and embedded practices that are invisible to most people that shape our world in profound ways. Zoning, parking requirements, building codes are all examples. One of these is the Traffic Impact Analysis, or TIA, process. When a large new development is proposed, local governments typically require an analysis of the traffic impacts. There is a standard process. Future trips from a development are estimated by looking up trip generation numbers for each of the proposed land uses. These trips are distributed and added to existing traffic on the street network, and the computer model estimates how much additional delay will occur during peak travel times at nearby intersections. The amount of delay is called level of service, or LOS, and it can range from A to F. What if the delay, or LOS, predicted by the model is considered unacceptable? Typically, there are two responses. Downsizing the development can reduce the trips, or capacity can be added to the intersection with more turn lanes, which means the intersection gets wider. These responses may address the localized traffic impact, but what is the cumulative impact of applying these two mitigations over and over again? Development sprawls further out, and streets become ever more difficult for pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders to negotiate. The very things that seek to reduce traffic locally may increase it regionally by lengthening travel distances and making other modes of transportation increasingly unattractive or impractical. What if there was another way of looking at transportation impacts? There is. It's called VMT, which stands for Vehicle Miles Traveled. Instead of examining delay at local intersections, VMT analysis asks a different question. How many miles of automobile travel will be added to the street and highway network if this project is built? This may sound like a minor distinction, but it can produce a dramatically different conclusion about impacts. Let's look at some examples. This subdivision on an undeveloped woodland is located in an area with low traffic volumes. There is plenty of capacity at nearby intersections to absorb additional car trips, so it passes an LOS test with flying colors. But it is far from job centers, retail, and services, so the residents will have to drive, and drive far to access their basic needs. From a VMT perspective, it has an outsized impact. This 6-story mixed-use building is located at a high-traffic intersection adjacent to a busy shopping center. While new trips might further congest the intersection, the residents of this building are a short walk from groceries, dining, shopping, and other day-to-day needs. The location is a short bike or drive to major job centers, served by bike share, and the building is also served by 2 bus routes. While a traditional LOS analysis might recommend limiting the amount of new housing in this location, from a VMT perspective, the more regional growth that can be directed to places like this, the better. Further, the anticipated congestion may never occur. Real-world traffic counts post-development often do not show the growth in traffic volumes that the models predict. As a metric, VMT is much more aligned with the climate goals set by triangle local governments. Unlike LOS, VMT has a direct relationship to how much fuel is burned by personal vehicles. Transportation accounts for over 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in Raleigh. What stands in the way of a broader switch to VMT? One factor is inertia. The LOS method has been an industry standard for decades. Engineering firms know how to produce the analysis, and transportation staff know how to review it. The second is methodology. Estimating VMT is harder than LOS, requiring more data and more complex models. Third, when a project is subject to public review, most interest comes from nearby neighbors who naturally focus on the immediate issues surrounding the site rather than the broader issues for the region. Fortunately, the science of VMT has made great strides, in part because California, the largest state, implemented a switch from LOS to VMT as part of state-mandated environmental quality reviews. Since so many projects in California are subject to environmental review, traffic engineers have had to quickly build and refine their models. The physicist John Wheeler once said, "We make the world by the questions we ask." LOS asked the question, how can we keep this intersection flowing freely? The usual answer to this question, wide roads and low densities, hasn't worked out in practice as a region grows. VMT asks a different question, which is, how can we create a world where people drive less? It turns out the answer to this question, mixed uses, build more densely, provide travel options, not only reflects where market demand is headed, but also what is needed to build more sustainably. Join us on February 9th at 1 p.m. to explore the California experience with VMT analysis and its implications for.
That was several February 9ths ago.
So as Shelby gets back to the slide deck here for us, just a good, we thought that was a good, short and concise explanation of how, you know, some of the land use decisions that get made, which frankly, if you just look at Wake County, are being made by 12 different decision-making bodies, right? And then transportation decisions, which are made by even more, are not always connected. And so one of the things that we heard loud and clear from the CAMPO Executive Board in our strategic plan update was that they want us to do a lot more to try and, at a minimum, educate our local government and member agencies, but also maybe even try and help provide other alternatives to the standard LOS-based, just go widen some more roads, add some more turn lanes, make intersections even bigger. So we have begun to do that, and it will take time. That's the thing that we have recognized very, very early on is it's going to take a lot of time, and trying to find the exact right role for CAMPO in that. We're still kind of feeling our way around with that, but a lot of this is going to be dependent on you all at the local government level to really implement. I mean, that's just the long and short of it. All right, we'll keep moving on here. So let's talk about some of our partners here for a few minutes. Who else is involved besides the MPO? And you can see there's a lot. There's other regional agencies, whether they be our neighboring MPOs or RPOs, different interest groups like Wake Up Wake County or the Regional Transportation Alliance. Regional Transportation Alliance also kind of falls in the private sector, but there's private developers and landowners and even transportation operators out there. There's federal and state agencies. There's, of course, the public. All of those are folks that we regularly need to engage with in order to have a successful 3C planning process. And of course, arguably one of the most important, you all, the local governments and local agencies that are the MPO. We always say, we are you and you are us. I mean, that really is sort of the baseline philosophy of what CAMPO is, right? While we are a separate entity, we only exist as a membership organization for all of you, the collective, right? What does that mean? Again, that's primarily through the executive board and your TCC membership on a regular basis. It's a time to interact both with your other local governments on transportation matters and other agencies together and your CAMPO staff, but also to be able to take information that you hear about or learn about with CAMPO back to your local agencies, your fellow board members, your fellow staff, your management. It really is a sort of a two-way conduit at the executive board and the TCC level. And I would say here, your success in CAMPO really largely depends on what you put into it. You're going to get out of it what you put into it. And I could parade through here many long-serving members of the MPO, and they'll tell you the same thing. When their local government or their agency really started to participate in CAMPO and get involved, that's when they started to see things happening in their community. So the more involved you are, the more things that can happen. We have also adopted a set of regional transportation policy priorities. I believe we have these on our website. But these are, so CAMPO by definition cannot go out and lobby elected officials for things, right? So we shy away from having a true legislative agenda. We leave that to you all, to the Metro mayors and the League of Municipalities and Association of County Commissioners and those groups. But we have identified and collectively with the Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro or DCHC MPO, a set of policy priorities that we all think are important for the Greater Triangle region to grow and grow in the way that we want it to grow. So within the region, again, the Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro MPO is one of our major partners. Collectively, the two MPOs cover, the entirety of the core of the Research Triangle region, but also many of the areas outside of that core as well. We also have the Burlington Graham Hall River MPO, which is to the west of the DCHC MPO. And we have several RPOs within our region that surround us as well. So Jason, to get at your question, currently the DCHC MPO is the only MPO that borders CAMPO. The rest of our boundary is bordered by RPOs, which are the rural counterpart to MPOs.
Quick question about RPOs. Is every bit of land in the state of North Carolina in either an MPO or an RPO?
I believe currently the answer to that is yes.
Okay. So there's an RPO between us and Fayetteville, for instance?
Correct, there is, yeah. So we have two MPOs. Why do we plan things together, right? I mean, it's sort of like, why do we have an MPO is so that when pick any adjoining jurisdictions, right, to make sure that they do things in a coordinated fashion, right? I mean, that's sort of the long and short of it. But you can see here, this is just a commuting pattern, not even full travel pattern, but just commute trips. There is a very large commute pattern that doesn't just all go to one place. It's not like everybody lives in the outlying areas and tries to go to work in downtown Raleigh, right? Or even in RTP. We have a variety of different places that everyone goes to every day for work and all their other business and activities, right? So we have a very disaggregated travel and commute pattern. And so that's why it's even more important to make sure that we are working together, planning together across the entire region. We also partner significantly in a very big way with the Triangle J Council of Governments. Now, Council of Governments, they are established in North Carolina and all over the country as another way to coordinate between and across the variety of different governmental entities that are out there. Some of the things they do for both CAMPO and the DCHC MPO, they help provide that cross-triangle coordination. We have bi-weekly meetings, staff level meetings with the two MPOs and Triangle J to make sure that things are on the right path. They assist with the development of the regional plan. We have one regional plan that's developed jointly between the two MPOs. They are officially two separate plans with two adoption steps by the different MPOs, but they are created together. And during the major elements that happen during an MTP development cycle, you may have CAMPO staff doing the travel forecast for the entire Triangle region for one of our future years, and you may have DCHC staff doing a model run for a different future year. So we sort of divide and conquer all of the multitude of tasks that are required to deliver that plan. Triangle J also provides coordination on a variety of other regional issues that are either directly related to transportation, like housing and land use, but also on things like water quality and other environmental areas that are ancillary and also important to be thinking about when we're talking about transportation planning. Keep hitting the wrong button. Again, the RPOs, they are the rural counterpart to MPOs. They are structured very similarly to MPOs. They were initially created under state law as a reaction to the federal requirement for rural consultation. And so in North Carolina, they are structured very similarly to MPOs, but some of their role and responsibility is a little bit different. So our neighboring RPOs are listed there on the bottom: the Curtar RPO, the Mid-Carolina RPO, Triangle Area RPO, and the Upper Coastal Plain RPO. And again, those cover all of the areas around our border with the exception of where the DCHC MPO is. So it's probably a good time to just pause here for a second. And those of you in the room, you should have a one-pager front and back that on one side, it has a listing of our, as of the printing date, the executive board and TCC members. You'll see they have names and email addresses on there. You'll also see you have our staff down in the blue box with phone numbers so you can reach folks. And on the other side of that, you'll see a couple of different charts on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, a not nearly exhaustive list of key acronyms. So those of you who are new to transportation, you probably have already figured out that it has more acronyms involved in it than almost any other area of professional work that I can think of or are aware of. And now that I've said that, I'm sure someone will point out one that has more, but there are a variety of acronyms on there. There's a lot of acronyms used during CAMPO meetings. So this will get you as a good start, but if we use an acronym and you're like, I don't know what that means, just flag us down during this training or during a TCC meeting or executive board meeting. We want to make sure folks understand what we're talking about. And trust me, there's probably 5 other people in whatever room you're in when that happens who don't know what that acronym means either. So. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Question. So I think you said the definition or what constitutes an MPO is that it's over 50,000 and that it's within an area that could experience or be connected by growth over 20 years. given that, do you see DCHC and CAMPO uniting or land being, I guess, area that would be under the jurisdiction of one being annexed to another or vice versa?
Yeah, great question. So since 1990, I believe the two urbanized areas, the Raleigh-Cary urbanized area and the Durham-Chapel Hill urbanized area have actually been connected. The census continues to define those as two separate urbanized areas. There has been discussion, I mean, going all the way back, I think the first time was in the 90s, but we have at least documentation from as late as 2003 of studies and reviews done to determine whether or not it would be a good idea for the two MPOs to merge into one MPO. Time and time again, the results of that have been just to make it a long story short, we want to work as closely together as we can, but we want to keep decision-making separate. And to sort of give you an operational example of that, could you imagine an MPO where you have people, maybe the mayor of Hillsborough is having to vote on a small TIP amendment because there was a project change on, let's say, even a Greenway project in Clayton, North Carolina. They're over an hour away from each other, right? As one MPO, you're then saying everyone has that vote on all of those MPO matters, right? So even from a practical standpoint, at some point you get pretty darn big. And so what we have tended to do is say, look, we recognize that there's a lot of cross travel that goes on, and the average person out there doesn't see the MPO boundary as anything other than a line on a map. But the same can be said for a county boundary or a city limit, boundary. So we have recognized that practically speaking, we need to be working together, and we work together a lot. We do the regional plan together. We coordinate our funding requests to the state together. We do a lot of special studies or planning studies together. We have a joint model. We do air quality conformity together. So we work together very, very closely. But the boards have decided that, at least up until now, they want that decision-making to remain separate for several different reasons, but not the least of which is most people can't wrap their head around somebody way over here having to vote, whether they want to or not, on something way over there, right? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
This
that
is
you,
Bonnie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So real quick, for folks that are online that are not, maybe have the chat open, this file has been shared as a PDF, what Chris is referring to with the acronyms and the members list. Chris, I will only interrupt you like this a couple more times maybe, but you do have a few points where I will put things in chat. So go to chat, and we're also going to send this out after the meeting.
Okay, thank you. So as great as our technology is in this room, I don't think we can actually show the chat up on the screen unless we share it off of another thing. So that's why we have a couple of people monitoring that for us. Yeah, Jason.
Ben also asked about trading or moving of the boundary between the two. And I don't think you addressed that question.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize there were two questions there. So we are in discussions about a couple of areas that are currently in one MPO, potentially swapping to the other MPO. And we've talked about that in the past and decided not to make the change. But we'll see where those conversations go this time. There are also portions of the city of Raleigh that are in Durham County, and there are portions of the city of Durham that are in Wake County. We have an agreement between the two MPOs to ensure that the 3C planning process takes place and is done so appropriately. These are very small areas, I should point out. It's not like you have huge sections of Raleigh that are in the DCHC MPO or vice versa. So that is an agreement that's been in place for many, many years. We generally review it each time we review boundaries. So we'll be doing that as well over the next year or two. Will be a lot of things will be happening that are required to happen every 10 years, but also we'll be reviewing and making sure we don't need to make any changes to those types of cooperative agreements. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I mean, it was Ben's question, I just noticed.
Does that answer your question, Ben? Okay.
Another quick question, is there a similar discussion on the other side of DCHs with the next MPO and the urbanized area from their western edge touching the eastern edge of the triad or something in between? And I wouldn't be surprised to hear that's also happening.
Yeah, so there's a little more space. They don't connect. The MPO boundaries connect, but the urbanized area doesn't connect.
Gotcha.
Right? And I'm not we could ask DCHC, but I'm not aware of any active discussions they have about any merging of the MPOs over there. Okay. All right. So one of our major partners for every MPO in North Carolina is the North Carolina Department of Transportation. How many of you have worked directly with NCDOT in some form or fashion? All right, cool. So you all know that it is a very big organization with lots of different units and divisions and agencies, if you will, within it, right? Some of whom have very little interaction with others, even though they're within the same state department, right? Just by definition. So, that's maybe a nice way of saying there are silos that exist at NCDOT, right? Some of that is by design, I think, and some of that is just the way things work, and they're trying to get rid of some of those silos, but they still exist. So on the screen there, you can see a whole host, and it's not even listing all of the different areas and units within NCDOT that we work with on a regular basis. But a couple of the important ones I will point out to you are what are listed there is the local divisions, sometimes called the geographic divisions. There's 14 of those in NCDOT. CAMPO covers parts of divisions 4, 5, and 6. So we have 3 division engineers and division staff that we work with. There are 3 Board of Transportation members that sit on the CAMPO Executive Board. The Transportation Planning Division, and then the third bullet there, the spot and programming units. That's the folks that's the place where all of the money gets decided, right? What big projects are going to get funded? That happens through the prioritization process, which you'll learn about a little bit later, and the programming unit. And then the next 2 there, the Integrated Mobility Division, that's really the other non-highway modal divisions. So within that, there's a lot going on there, but we work very closely with that division. And then the next item there, the project development, design and environmental units. Those are the folks that are tasked with doing all of what's called project development. So the project level planning, the design, the environmental review for those big projects that get funded through the TIP. And then at the bottom there, you can see the toll authority. We are one of the few areas of the state that have active toll projects, so we are very involved, more so than many other parts of the state, with what's going on at the toll authority. So just a couple other notes about NCDOT. I always like to remind everyone they are responsible for maintaining over 80,000 miles of roadway. That's centerline miles, not lane miles, right? We keep flip-flopping, I think, depending on what year it is, with the state of Texas over which state has the most responsibility for the largest amount of transportation network. North Carolina, and then you think about Texas. Anybody ever been to Texas? It takes like 2 days to drive across Texas. It's a huge state, much larger than North Carolina. So a lot of that is actually I guess the byproduct of after the Great Depression, the state coming in and taking over all of the local, both municipal and county roads and transportation network. Then in the 1940s, the municipal roads were given back, and the authority to build and maintain roads was reinstituted. And it was only fairly recently that counties were then basically given the authority back to own and maintain roadway. But again, they have a very, very big set of responsibilities. They're divided into 14 highway divisions or geographic divisions. The way that the money works, especially the federal money, it comes down from the federal government. it goes to NCDOT, and then it goes out to the projects or to the MPOs or to the local governments from there. So many of our planning products are the things that drive the decisions that are made about, especially that federal money. So here's just a visual for those of you who are tired of bullet points at this point in the slide deck of those different divisions. Again, CAMPO makes up part of divisions 4, 5, and 6, sort of in the just to the right of center on this map.
I was just trying to point it out, but the
Okay.
cursor's lagging. So
I thought you were saying
it's
no
not
to
working.
me. Like you made
You're right.
something wrong. And then finally, Jason, the map I knew we had in here, but I thought it was a lot earlier in the slide deck off of memory. This map is showing you all how many different planning boundaries in transportation there are. And just keep in mind, this doesn't include the local boundaries. So you can see the counties, the MPOs, the RPOs, the planning regions that the state Department of Transportation has set up. A lot of different overlap, and none of those really follow any discernible physical boundary. I mean, some of them do, like a river or something, but you know, the boundary between Wake and Johnston County is a straight line or nearly straight line that you don't know you've crossed until you see the sign, right? Or one of my personal favorites, if you go to the Walmart, at least it used to be this way, the Walmart that's over in Northwest Morrisville, depending on what checkout line you go through, your sales tax goes to one county or the other county. What? Yeah. So yes, there was a short period of time where if you went and bought a pack of gum and you were on the western side or the non-food side, and you bought that pack of gum, you were paying into the Durham County Transit Sales Tax. And in Wake County, I don't think you were on the other side, but now you pay into both. Probably made it a lot easier for them to pay sales tax, you know, up to the state at that point, but anywho. So some of our other partners at the federal level, the Federal Transit Administration, they are responsible and coordinate with all of the public transportation providers out there. All of the federal financial assistance, whether it be grants or loans that are geared towards public transportation, go through the FTA. There are a variety of different flavors of federal funding across all the different funding sources. And I think that federal highways and federal transit probably have some of the greatest variety out there. And you can see sort of on that second bullet, what are called sections 5303, 07, 5310, 5339, and 5340. That's only listing some of them. Those are funding sources named after the section of the federal law that establishes them. And they all have different uses. Federal highways has even more. If I were to list them out, it would take up 17 slides, so we're not going to do that here. But federal highways allocates those funds to the states. They're administered by NCDOT for active MPO operations, planning activities, and then when it comes to the big projects, even if they are going to be locally managed by a county or a city or someone on the highway side, those funds flow through NCDOT to the project. They also are responsible for the once every 4 years certification process that we have. So every 4 years, the federal government comes in and reviews how well we are meeting the requirements of the 3C planning process. We did that just about 2 years ago at this point, so we'll do it again in about 2 more years. And I'm happy to report to you all that I think for the second or third time in a row here that I can remember, we have not had any significant findings or areas that we had a problem that had to be immediately addressed. There are recommendations, but there are also several what they call, at one time or another, they've either called them commendations or noteworthy practices that your MPO is recognized for each time we go through this. And any of you that really want to read through that, I think it's actually available on our website. If you can't find it though, and you really want to read through the last certification review report, we're happy to provide that to you. So some of the planning funds that we use for our operations here. We have, I think what is commonly recognized as the primary funding source for MPO planning operations, known as PL 104 funds. These are funds that come through federal highways. They're population-based, so there's a total amount allocated to each state based on the state urbanized area population, and then that money is distributed to each MPO based on population. STPBG, DA. So all these, whenever we talk about something, we use the term DA, it means direct attributable. And those are funds that essentially flow directly to us. They go through NCDOT, but the decision-making rests solely at the MPO. Okay.
Is it direct attributable or direct allocation?
It depends on who you ask, but it's direct attributable. It's direct attributable, yeah. Direct allocation would make sense, but I think when anything I can remember seeing from NCDOT, it's direct attributable. So in other states, those are called other things. They might be called STPBG Metro, they might be called Flex, they might be called local, they might just be called direct. So the DA modifier on here is unique to North Carolina. That's just what we all collectively decided to call it. Okay, realize that. Yeah, so if you go and look at the funds that are used, the funding that we use for our locally administered projects program, those exact same funds in another state have a slightly different name to totally confuse everybody. So stay in North Carolina, don't go work in another state, and you won't get confused. SPR funds are funds that are federal funds that are provided to the state Department of Transportation. So the decision-making on how those funds are used rests with NCDOT. On occasion, they will provide some of these funds to provide for their share of a jointly funded planning project. So in the past, things like our Northeast area study or Southwest area study, or even Southeast area. Wait, I said Southwest, Southeast, and Northeast area studies. That's the better way to say that. Have all had some SPR funding provided to help support those processes. Okay. Transit funds, again, there's a variety of different transit funds that are used for planning activities or can be used for planning activities. Here in our region, most of those funds are delegated to our transit providers through a joint agreement that basically uses roughly the same formula that figured out how much money should come to our region. We then use that formula to provide the funds out to the transit agencies. There are a few minor differences on a few of them, but generally that's how we do that. And then unique to our region are Wake Transit funds. So Wake County is one of the counties where a referendum was held in 2016. Transit funding was created through a successful referendum through 3 different tax sources or registration fees that the CAMPO Executive Board is one of the what are known as the governing boards for Wake Transit funding decision making. Some of our planning activities that are directly related to Wake Transit, the Wake Transit program, are funded through that program. But most of those funds do go to the transit agencies. So that was a lot of information. Any questions? That is a question. Just thinking about it.
Okay, so I'm trying to understand if there are funds coming from the FTA. Some of them might be directly administered by CAMPO. Are other funds administered by NCDOT? And if so, how do you differentiate which funds are being administered by whom?
Yeah, so what I'll first say in answering that question is there probably should be a 3-hour Federal Transit Funding 101 class. It is a different environment than the other modes for sure. So with transit, some of the funds go directly from the federal government to the transit agencies. The state is not involved at all. So Go Raleigh and Go Cary and Go Triangle are examples of some of those transit agencies that are direct recipients of federal funding, okay? So as long as they're meeting requirements, the governing boards for those agencies get to decide how that money is used, okay? And the state is not involved in that at all, or in the decision-making for how the funds are used. Let me put it that way. Some of those funding sources that I mentioned fall under that category. There's also Section 5307 funding, for example. Some of that funding is also provided to NCDOT as the direct recipient on behalf of some of the smaller transit systems in smaller urbanized areas. Those transit systems work through NCDOT to utilize that funding. Okay, does that help?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay, good.
We also had Jennifer Delcourt, I saw your hand raise. Did you have a question?
Sorry, no, that was just a quick test.
Oh, okay. Well, I liked it.
It was like a
because-
wave.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And we know we can see that now, so
Good.
that was good news.
Other questions, either in the room or online? Okay, well, if you think of any, post them in the chat and we will circle back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the planning requirements that we have. And I think right after this section, we have a break, so hang in there. So now that you are all just barely understanding or introduced to what MPOs are, let's talk about a whole other class of MPOs, the larger MPOs, those MPOs that have urbanized area populations greater than 200,000 people, again, according to the Census Bureau, are designated as transportation management areas. These areas have a greater level of responsibility, greater level of say in certain areas. They also get additional funding, but they have greater responsibilities. And a few of them are listed up there that are probably the biggies there. TMAs have to have a congestion management process, and they also are responsible for performance measures. The smaller MPOs, under 200,000, don't necessarily have all of those same requirements. And on the screen there, you can kind of see the blue highlighted, well, the purple areas on the screen are all those urbanized areas in the state. The ones that have the light blue highlight, those are those TMA areas in North Carolina.
That's a federal requirement that's a part of, was that new with
No.
FAST?
No, TMA designations have been around since the 90s, I believe. So the funds that we get and we use for our LAP program are a direct result of being a TMA. If we were not a TMA, we would not have those funds. That's probably the biggest example of a difference, for your all's purposes and interest between being a TMA and not being a TMA. The MPOs that have a urbanized area population between 50,000 and 200,000, they don't get those direct funds. So they don't have something like a LAP they couldn't have something like a LAP program. They don't get those funds.
So they give us a lot more responsibility and a little bit more money to cover it.
That's the nutshell you should remember there, right? A lot more responsibility and only a little bit more money to cover that. But we do get some funds that we can use for construction of projects now.
Is that list of additional responsibilities exhaustive on that slide?
No.
Okay, I didn't think so.
Those are the two main ones for you guys to really focus on, right? I mean, at one point, we did have a version of this many, many years ago that had a lot more regulatory stuff in there. And feedback from, your predecessors was like, this is really boring. So we tried to, maybe get a little bit more to the point of what's really important to you all. So I'm sure many of you think all of this is really boring, but it's evolving. It's evolving. Air quality conformity is another major responsibility that we have. Again, as I said earlier, it has gotten a little easier, thankfully, because our air quality has gotten better. Not saying we have perfect air quality or we don't have, more improvement to make, but it is better than it used to be, which is why the process has gotten a little simpler. So air quality regions have been established that, of course, don't line up with MPO boundaries or county boundaries or anything like that. And so we are responsible for the conformity process within our planning boundary. Our air quality region, it also includes the DCHC MPO and portions of several RPOs. So we work with NCDOT and those RPOs and the Durham MPO to ensure that conformity is maintained. The results of not being in conformity is that projects will be delayed and funding will be withheld. So it's pretty important that we make sure we get this done right every time we do it. So the primary way we do that is ensuring that we have an adopted MTP and TIP that can demonstrate that the projects will not have an adverse effect on the air quality budgets that have been set by the state and approved by the federal government. And thankfully, we have continued to demonstrate that we can meet our needs with the funding we have and the budgets that have been established, the air quality budgets that have been established. Every few years, there's new federal transportation legislation that tends to be passed or continuing resolutions that tend to modify, usually adding to what our responsibilities are, or modifying how we meet the existing responsibilities that we have. Excuse me. So more recent consultation requirements have been further refined to ensure that we are coordinating and consulting with those agencies that are responsible for land use management, primarily local governments, natural resources, environmental protection, conservation, and historic preservation. And of course, even more recently, the performance measure requirements up to and including setting targets across a variety of different performance measures. So the most recent version of these changes to federal law are known to totally confuse people by two different names, IIJA and BIL. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is how many folks have really been referring to what is also known as IIJA law. This is the most recent federal legislation on transportation authorization. It continues the funding programs that were in place from its predecessor known as the FAST Act. It continues to require intermodal transportation planning, so across all modes. It has increased the focus on safety and accessibility and climate change. It has also provided some additional policy requirements for coordinating transportation planning and specifically housing. So while coordination with land use has been around in the regs for a while, the specific for housing is fairly new. Now, the specifics of that requirement are still all getting worked out. So generally what happens is something like the bipartisan infrastructure law is passed, then there is a period of time that can range from a few months to several years of rulemaking. Then after the rulemaking is done, guidance is provided. So sometimes some of these requirements don't actually kick in for several years. And this housing stuff is one of those areas where the rulemaking and the guidance is still being developed. So more to come on that. Almost every program that was in existence, as well as some of the new programs, have seen an increase in the funding level, which is great. Many of those funding sources we've already talked about, those federal funding sources we have seen an increase in the amount of funding that is coming into those programs. So some of the new programs that came out, and we've already talked about some of these, and you've seen information about some of these. They've even had calls for projects on some of these. But carbon reduction program, the Reconnecting Communities program, the Protect program, and Justice 40 are just a few. The IIJA is probably one of the largest introductions of the largest amount of discretionary or competitive funding that we've ever seen on the transportation side. So seems like almost every day now there, or every week now, there is some call for projects that we're seeing come out from the federal government in transportation specifically. So lots of different opportunities are coming about. But for almost every one of these, there are a few things that tend to be similar. If it's not a planning activity, if it's like to build something, that's got to be in the MTP. It's probably got to be pretty close to being shovel ready, meaning it's got NEPA done, it's got its project development done. And the closer you are to being ready to bid something out, the more successful your project is going to be. So we'll talk more about how to be successful a little bit later, but those are just a few things to keep in mind about any of these discretionary funding programs.
Chris, can you tell us anything about the level of increase in DA funding from the previous few years to the next few years? Do we know that yet? And so what I'm kind of wondering about is how much it could theoretically lap increase, but then also understanding that cost increases in the last couple of years of projects are going to eat into that.
Yeah.
So we're not necessarily going to see that in future call for projects.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know what we're talking about when we say LAP, Chandler, a little bit later, will be giving you an overview of the LAP program. But speaking to the funding, so a couple of things have happened, right? Increased funding for the overall annual program has happened from MAP 21 to the FAST Act to now IIJA / bipartisan infrastructure law. Just the total budget has gone up each year. Under the IIJA, it goes up each year even more. Also happening, which is why I'm not giving you a direct answer, is once the Census Bureau has released the urbanized area, the 2020 urbanized area populations, which they have, the next full federal fiscal year will utilize that population number to calculate budgets, right? So what happens with almost all federal funding is it goes off of your latest decennial census number. Right, some of them use urbanized areas, some of them use county, some of them use MSA population, but across all federal departments, almost all of that federal funding uses the latest decennial census, even if that is 10 years old. So all of our funding for the last 10 years has been based on our 2010 urbanized area population of 998,989 or something like that. Now we know just the Raleigh Cary urbanized area 2020 population is like 1.2 million. So even if the funding levels didn't change, our slice of the pie gets bigger, right? But the funding levels have changed, our slice has changed. And once we finalize everything with what's going to happen with the Clayton urbanized area, that would also play into how much money we get or don't get.
Right.
So if you will allow me to just say, hold on a few months, then I can give you a clear answer.
Does losing Clayton from the transportation management area mean that they, regardless of whether they're in the MPO or not, which is kind of to some extent a political decision, does that mean that their population won't be counted in that calculation?
Yeah, so it's the urbanized area population, not the TMA area population, right? So our core urbanized area is the Raleigh-Cary urbanized area, which is 1.2 million, okay? That is greater than what it was in 2010, significantly greater than that.
Right.
So we will still see a greater slice of the pie, regardless of what happens with them.
What I'm getting at is the Clayton urbanized area, and I'm just gonna guess it's 60,000. I have no idea what that number is. You guys probably know. Does that 60,000 get added into the 1.2?
It should.
Calculate that?
It should for our share of any of the urbanized area based funding. If they remain in CAMPO, then that should increase that size of the pie we get.
But because if they decided to form their own MPO, they wouldn't get DA funding because they'd be less than 200,000.
Correct. The only funding that they would get then is the planning operational funding, the PL funding,
okay.
and some transit funding.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Under the federal regulations, there are things known as the federal planning factors, and they are all listed up there on the screen. And you can see they're pretty high level things like safety, right? These also align fairly well with our adopted goals for the region. And so all of our planning activities, particularly our MTP, have to address these planning factors. So we have a whole section in our adopted MTP that explain how we address each of these. We also have performance measures. Now, there are federally mandated performance measures, and then there are other performance measures that we as a region have decided are important to us. But first and foremost, we have to make sure we address the federally mandated performance measures. So those are in the orange on the screen. So it's infrastructure condition, congestion reduction, safety, system reliability, freight and economic vitality, environmental sustainability, and project delivery. The targets for each of these measures are determined jointly by the state and by CAMPO for our region. So historically on these, we have adopted the state target. And you'll note with something like safety or infrastructure condition, again, they are responsible for the majority of our transportation network. So we do largely look to what they're thinking is a reasonable target for those performance measures. We can do our own, but we'll then have to demonstrate how our specific target will help the state meet their target. So, and in the past, we had, at one point, the guidance was that in something like safety, if we want to go our own way and have our own safety targets, those targets would not just apply to the state system, transportation system, but the locally maintained system as well. And what we found was that across all of our jurisdictions, the data needed to support performance tracking on that was not where it needed to be. So, and then further guidance has come out more recently about this really applies to the national highway system and a few other things. So we continue to look at each cycle. Some of these have to be adopted annually. Some of them have to be adopted every 2 years and some every 4 years. So we continue to review and look at whether it makes sense to go with the state target or go our own way each time we look at these things.
Chris?
Yeah.
You probably meet all your performance metrics, but if, for instance, you don't.
Let me, I shake my head no for those of you that are online. The ones specific to MPO operations, we do meet. But the system stuff like safety, the state is not meeting its safety targets. They have set an extremely aggressive safety target. We are consistently not meeting that. I'm sorry to interrupt your question.
What's the consequence of that?
Right, so the consequence for it is a little bit different, I think, for each target, but safety is a good example. So the consequence for not meeting it is that the state would be required to fully utilize all of the safety funding that they're getting from the federal government. North Carolina already does that and then some, right? So they're spending all their federal safety dollars on projects in the STIP. And then they're taking state dollars on top of that, right? The state has set an extremely aggressive safety target, trying to get to vision zero, essentially. I think they want to get there by initially I thought it was 2035, but maybe it's 2045 now, 2050. Alex, do you remember? I'm forgetting what year it is. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I thought it was 2030.
2030, okay. So they basically said, we're here, we want to get here by this amount of time. So they just did the math and said, we want this trend line to go down. The problem is that's not what's happening out there in reality. So a lot of other states have not been nearly as aggressive as North Carolina has been in setting some of these targets. And so when you look at just the data, the results each cycle, and you say, whoa, this is going the wrong way, right? I don't know that our trend is different than a lot of other states out there, but some of those other states have set targets that aren't as nearly as aggressive as North Carolina has. But I guess the short answer to your question is you would be required to spend all of that money, which North Carolina already is doing. Okay. So questions on any of that regulatory stuff? Yeah.
Can we go back to the population just?
Okay.
Because it's come up in other kind of economic development circles. What's the relationship, I guess, with the MSA in the MPO? Because I know that it's come up in conversations about, wouldn't we be more competitive as a region if our MSAs were, and I know that there's the combined statistical area, but generally from an economic development, they do rankings of MSAs and size and things like that. And it's been said, well, if the MPOs were combined, then we'd all have one population, one MSA. And I don't know that I've never quite fully understand if that's true, how that would all be reported.
So there's no direct link between MPO designation and MSA.
Okay.
They're used for different things. They all come out of definitions and designations by the Census Bureau, but MSA does not play into MPO designation or anything at all. So, you know, and for many years we had multiple MSAs, right, in the triangle, even before they had the CMSA, right? But for transportation purposes, the urbanized area is what matters.
Okay, just to make sure, because I think I understand what if there was a push to combine and create one MSA that was Durham, like I'm trying to think of the Durham.
The Triangle MSA, let's just call it that.
Let's call it the Triangle MSA. Would that would not preclude there being two MPOs within there?
I am not aware of any rule or regulation that would impact MPO designation.
Those are based on urbanized areas, not the MSA, the boundaries. Okay, thank you for.
Yeah. Other questions? Online? Yeah, go ahead.
This is Glenn York.
We can hear you.
Yep.
Yes. Could you speak on how does land use for transportation affect land value for housing?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you asking what does a transportation project do to land value, specifically housing, or are you asking a different question?
It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically for housing, but just in general.
Okay, so I think that transportation projects, right? They can have a positive and a negative effect on land value, right? If you open up access to land, you're probably going to increase the value of that land. If you put in a superhighway, the land right adjacent to it may or may not go up or down in value. We've actually seen both happen in North Carolina, right? You know, I'm trying to think of a few examples around the region right now. And one I know that was just in the newspaper or the Triangle Business Journal not too long ago was the Viridia project near Apex and Holly Springs, right? About 1,000 acres, pretty much vacant land today. You build 540 and it's taken a little while, but those land values are skyrocketing, right? And the price of real estate as that is now moving forward is going to be likely probably at the higher end of the different markets out there, right? Whether it's residential or commercial or office. And you know, I think there's an argument to be made that if 540 and the other and US 1 were not there, and NC 55 wasn't there, that land value probably wouldn't be as high as it's going to be, or it already is. So I hope that answers your question, but if I didn't, tell me and I'll try again.
Somewhat, I guess I was thinking about more or less if a project would affect the already existing housing market.
Yeah, got okay. So I think again, it would be specific to the property and the project. We've seen across the different modes, whether it be highways or even public transit, when certain types of transportation investments are made, property values do go up. And in other circumstances, they may have gone down a little bit. But generally, I think the trend is that we're seeing as investments in the transportation network are made at sort of a system level or a regional level, that property values are going up.
Chris, I wonder if, speaking of communities like Zebulon or going farther down I-40, as we make, who currently have a congested travel commute into the triangle, as you widen 87, as you widen I-40, and you're easing the congestion and make it easier for folks to commute in from farther out, does that increase those property values? And on one hand, I think probably so, but on the other hand, I think the overall growth of the triangle is probably doing that regardless of the widening of the road. It's the values, property values closer into the triangle that younger families need to move farther out regardless of how congested I-40 is in order to buy a house. So it does play a role, but I wonder if just the overall growth of the triangle doesn't have a greater impact than whether or not we did a specific widening.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think you're right, Alex. So maybe another way to say this is that transportation investments are a driver, but not the driver of property values in an area. Jason, you have a question?
No, I was going to make a comment or maybe it is a question. One of the things you said is in the IIJA is some coordination on transportation and housing, which is maybe a part of where that question was coming from. I tend to agree with what you said, Alex. I think it would be very, very, very difficult to derive the percentage responsibility, and causation and correlation are a really challenging thing. But I wonder if that guidance might end up starting to incorporate a housing and transportation affordability rather than, we are in the triangle, there are a lot of conversations about housing affordability for good reasons, but I have not heard people talking much about the combination of housing and transportation and the money that you put into maintaining your car and paying for parking and paying for gasoline or electricity to run it and insurance and all those things are a part of, the difficulty of, or, I guess the challenge of your budget. And there's a lot of in some places it's very easy to swap less transportation expense for more housing expense, but nobody's really talking about that in the triangle that I hear. And so maybe that's one of the places where some of that coordination with land use and transportation might go in the triangle is helping us think about those things a little bit more and maybe even going as far as evaluating projects from that standpoint in the future too.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and the two MPOs are working with Triangle J and Go Triangle to try and figure out a way to do sort of what initially started out as thinking of a transportation and housing, regional transportation and housing plan. I think we're expanding that to land use, but would include a specific housing element. And not to develop a regional plan, right? I mean, we try to we all, including, I think, Triangle J, try to be very careful about, land use decision-making, land use management, that is a local responsibility. No one wants to change that. But certainly having more coordination between the decision makers is got to be a part of the conversation moving forward. So, I know they've looked at whether a project like that, a planning project like that would qualify for earmarks, whether it would work on some of the other discretionary programs that we're seeing come out. So I think there's more to come on that, especially in the next few months.
Commissioner Stallings, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yes, really just a comment. Thank you all. So I'm Cheryl Stallings. I currently serve on the Wake County Board of Commissioners, but prior to that, I served on the Apex Town Council, and I do appreciate this conversation. And I will say that in Apex, and I think on the county level as well, we are having those conversations. It's very important when we talk about affordable housing that housing be close to transit. And so I just want to say I appreciate the conversation, but I do know those conversations are going on in Wake County, and they're very important to do so.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, well, again, if you have questions along the way you think of, just put them in the chat and we can circle back. And with that, we're at our first break. So what are we doing?
So I have a timer set for 15 minutes. Is that going to work? Or?
Yes, it will. So.
I mean, does 15 minutes work?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So we'll take about a 15-minute break. That'll put you guys back here at 5 till 11. 11:55.
Bathrooms.
Thanks, everyone.
Star added some coffee.
Very cool. Your number 4. I don't know if it's still the same, but I mean, let me double check.
You do?
415.
Translation.
See, and I haven't even yet had it in, but maybe in April, I'm thinking. All right, let me see.
You go, I need to get in touch with Mustang and Tom
Oh, no, because that.
I have you here. Actually, I have you listed twice. I don't know why I had you listed twice.
I know we did coordinate quite a bit on whatever that program.
All righty, here we go, everybody. If you're online, if you want to go ahead and join us.
Oh, you, okay, it worked.
You have to be quiet because they can hear everything you say. I've heard a lot of interesting stuff. Just restarted the timer.
I do.
Next time. It's working. All right, welcome back. Just want to confirm that everybody online can still hear us. Let me get a thumbs up or a yes or.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Loud and clear. Great.
Yes.
All right, so were there any other questions on the last section before we get into this next section of the session today? All right, if not, I'm going to go over some of our functions, programs, and products that we have here at the MPO. Chris talked a lot this morning about kind of how we're set up, where our funding comes from, and I'm going to talk more about what we do with those things. So Chris mentioned earlier the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or MTP. This is our federally required planning document, and it's federally required to cover at least 20 years of the next 20 years of growth in the area and the transportation needs that are needed to meet that growth. We also have what's called our Comprehensive Transportation Plan, which is a state requirement. What we do is have an unfunded kind of vision element of our MTP that we use as our Comprehensive Transportation Plan. So the MTP has to be fiscally constrained, which means we have to assume that there are enough revenues coming in from a variety of sources to cover the transportation projects that we're showing in the MTP. The MTP also has those projects listed by decade. So we have a 10-year horizon, a 20-year horizon, and a 30-year horizon. The 10-year horizon is basically things that are either going to be funded locally that we know of, or things that are going to be funded through the state TIP. They have a pretty defined and dedicated funding source. We also have the Wake Transit Plan, which we'll get into in more detail later on today. But the Wake Transit Plan is the first 10 years of transit funding in the MTP. The next decade, which would be the 20-year horizon, we can get a little bit more creative with what we're assuming for revenues. We don't do that independently. Obviously, we do that with the assistance of our TCC and our executive board to be able to assume things like an increased transportation tax, for instance, or increased property taxes that would go to transportation, or just other revenue sources that we don't currently have in existence that we try to assume so that we can try to meet the needs of the transportation network in the future. Our revenues and our costs must balance. The federal government will check that, and if they don't balance, then we don't have a functional MTP and our projects cannot move forward. And as I mentioned, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan is the unfunded element, so things beyond 30 years that we know are going to be needed, but we don't have a revenue source assigned to those. The Transportation Improvement Program is, we're going to go into this in a little more detail later on today as well, but this is basically the implementation arm of our MTP. You'll find a lot of RPOs and some MPOs across the state will do a call for projects every 2 years and ask locals what their priorities are for putting projects into the TIP. What CAMPO does is try to use the TIP to implement our MTP. We hope that your local priorities are fed up into our MTP. That's why that's important for that to happen. And we use our MTP to drive the process that we use with the state prioritization to try to get projects funded in the TIP.
The TIP is our local transportation improvement program. The state's transportation improvement program is called the STIP, STIP. Those two documents must match in order for the projects to move forward. Again, the federal government is watching that and makes sure that the TIP and the STIP match dollar for dollar and project for project. Another,
Question about that.
yeah, Jason.
Does that mean effectively that both the MPO and the state could veto each other's things by not doing it? So it's a mutual assured destruction.
Yes. Yep. Mutual assured destruction or assured success. But yeah, that is one of the basic kind of powers of the MPO. That's where you get your local powers being part of an MPO, is that kind of veto power, which is where that 3C planning process comes into play. You need to work closely with the state to make sure everybody's priorities are on the same page moving forward. The Unified Planning Work Program is what we use to help identify projects and conduct planning studies that help inform our MTP and our TIP prioritization. So we do a Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, every year. It outlines our budget and the tasks that our staff is going to undertake for the year. It also includes transit planning funding. So for instance, Raleigh is doing a lot of TOD planning with some federal transit funding. That's included in our UPWP because it's federal transportation planning funds that are being utilized in the region. Most of the federal planning funds that are being utilized in the region have to be reflected in our TIP. There's some specific exclusions to that rule with specific funding sources, but by and large, if federal funding is being used, it needs to be reflected in our TIP. In our UPWP. Our work program is funded 80% through federal funds with a 20% local match. Our member agencies are charged on a per capita basis. We actually have a little bit more than 20% that comes in through our local match to cover things beyond what are allowed in the federal program. For instance, the snacks you're having today. Things like that, things like dues, and some other things that are not allowed as part of federal funding. We do have a little bit of buffer with extra local match. So just to kind of help visualize how these things work together, our CTP, again, is everything beyond 2050 right now. Our current MTP goes out to 2050, and our CTP is things that we know are going to be needed, but that we can't afford before 2050. Our MTP, again, goes out to 2050. It's adopted every 4 years, so it's continually updated. We use the intervening 4 years to work on planning studies, figure out projects, figure out prioritization, and continually update that plan to keep moving out in the future. We're already working on our 2055 MTP. And then the TIP, again, is a 10-year state and local coordinated effort that gets updated roughly every 2 years. I talked a bit about the comprehensive transportation plan. Wake County's comprehensive transportation plan is just the MTP. Those areas of Granville, Franklin, Harnett, and Johnston County, they have full county CTPs. The portion of that CTP that's within CAMPO is adopted into the CAMPO MTP as the CTP element for those areas, just to make sure that those things are matching up appropriately for those counties. So the CTP, again, is a statewide requirement. It includes a highway element, a public transportation and rail element, and a bicycle and pedestrian element. So you'll see several different maps and styles of maps that come from the NCDOT that we try to have corresponding maps at the MPO. They're not always one-to-one, but we try to follow along with their rules in order to meet the needs of our local governments with those things. The Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which we have on an ArcGIS online map on our website that you can look at. It's here on this link. We also have the various modes included in our MTP, and those are different layers in the map that you can see. But again, the MTP goes beyond just those transportation projects. It also discusses those federal planning factors that Chris mentioned earlier. It discusses the goals of the MPO as a region, our planning goals, and how we're conducting air quality conformity, and how we're following other rules that are in place for the MPO. So it's a very comprehensive document. It is federally mandated, and it does more recently have an emphasis on preservation and efficiency of the system, which means trying to better utilize the roads that we have in place rather than a bunch of new location roads, which is not to say there are not new location roads on our map. There are certainly new location roads on our map. But our board over the past several years has wanted to expand, the bicycle and pedestrian element and the transit element to have a more comprehensive view of how people are traveling in the region. Again, fiscally constrained, that's one of the most important parts. We can't just put everything that everybody thinks of into the MTP, which is why we try to work with you all pretty closely with your local planning efforts to make sure those things are reflected in the MTP when we update it every 4 years. The MTP also includes extensive public involvement. You can imagine that it's pretty hard for non-transportation people to wrap their minds around 50 years worth of transportation projects across 5 counties. That's a tough sell to get people to care about that. We do a lot of public engagement around some of our smaller planning studies that help inform some of our MTP projects. And we also have partnered with our local member agencies with some of your local planning projects and public events and things like that to try to help engage the public. But by and large, we rely on our member agencies to really be reflective of the public priorities in your areas within the MPO. So every year we do a variety of planning studies. We've done several large area studies. We've done corridor studies. We've done what we call hotspot studies, which we started doing back in 2011 when we had some extra money at the end of 1 year and had a few unanswered questions that needed some kind of extra engineering work done. And most other years, we've done a few more of those hotspot studies just on things that have popped up around the region. We've done other special studies. We did something called the commuter corridor study, which was looking at the question of how do you get the red out of this map for the future? How do you reduce all this congestion? The answer is you do not reduce all the congestion. You figure out how to plan more appropriately around it. And enhance some of those network connection opportunities and multimodal connection opportunities to help it not get so red, help it not turn purple. We've also participated in some local land use and transportation plans. CAMPO has a planning staff here. We've served on local committees for greenway plans or bicycle plans or land use plans, just to provide that regional transportation perspective. And then, of course, we're also charged with maintaining the Wake Transit Plan. So just for an example, when Apex was recently doing their comprehensive plan for the town, we provided the basis for that land use element of their comprehensive plan through our community viz model. Our community viz model is what we use to look at existing and planned future land uses, and that kind of bubbles up into our socioeconomic data that tells our model where people are living and working and want to get to in the region. So we helped them with the community viz model aspect of things, took the data from their comprehensive plan and put it back into our community viz model so that our Apex area was reflective of the things that they were planning locally. And then we also provided staff to help them kind of think of their local transportation recommendations from their plan in a more regional context. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, our commuter corridor study. During, I think, the 2040 MTP development, one of our executive board members just said, you keep showing us these congestion maps and they don't seem to be getting better. How can we make them better? And so we did this study and said, let's go crazy and let's put 15 lanes on I-40 and see if that does it. It does not. So even with those kind of draconian measures, having those, if you build it, they will drive on it kind of mentality of people and reality of people tells us that wider roads and more roads is not going to be the answer to the congestion here in the region. So the results of this were that looking at more transit-oriented development, focusing denser development along transit corridors, having bicycle and pedestrian connections, requiring shorter trips, connecting housing and jobs, things like that are the things that help that congestion to not grow. And this has helped inform some of the work and the prioritization of future projects and future MTPs. So if you're a planning professional, you're probably familiar with this basic planning process. This is the basic planning process we use to update our MTP. The overall active process usually takes 18 months, sometimes 24 months, but we're actually working on it for however many months 4 years is. We start on it kind of 2 days after the adoption of an MTP. We're already starting to work on the next MTP. So it's a continually evolving thing. But we will get to a point where we update our vision and goals for the region. We do a lot of public engagement around that. We do a lot of looking at your local plans to see if visions and goals are trending in a different way. You know, in recent years, environmental goals have become a lot more prevalent in local planning efforts, and so have also kind of grown in importance in the MTP vision and goals. We also review what we did during the previous MTP and see if that's still relevant, and use kind of survey tools to ask the public, are these things still relevant? Are these things still important to you? What other things are important to you? And those kind of get elevated up into our goals and objectives. Excuse me, the pollen has gotten to me. Then we go through an analysis and evaluation. So again, we start with our existing MTP. We look at what projects are on there. Are those still relevant? Are those still necessary? Have those been completed? What is being planned locally? Are there updated local transportation plans? Are there other deficiencies that didn't show up in our last plan that are showing up now? We use a lot of that interim planning work that we do, our area studies or corridor studies, to plug in new assumptions for different areas across the region. And then we develop and evaluate a variety of land use and transportation scenarios. We go out for public engagement and talk a lot with our TCC and executive board about those scenarios, and then select a preferred option. This is how we would like to be able to move forward, and this is how we think we can afford to be able to move forward in this fashion. Now, the fiscal feasibility part of that is what always comes into play. There's always, especially when you think 50 years in the future, there's a lot of lofty goals and desire for drastic changes, but without the local foundation of land use regulations or other funding sources, some of those things just cannot be put into the MTP because they're not going to be recognized as realistic. So that's a trade-off discussion we always have to have when we get to that point. And then after we have our preferred option, we do some final model runs, and we make sure our fiscal component is accurate, that our revenues are matching our expenses, and we do the air quality conformity work, which is basically going through and making sure that none of the projects we have planned are making the air quality any worse. And then we look at implementation and performance metrics and how this plan is meeting those performance metrics and things like that, and all of that gets documented into the MTP. Chris mentioned earlier that we do a joint MTP with the DCHC MPO. These are the elements, the discrete elements that we do together with that MPO. We do maintain separate actions and separate maps and actual separate plans. There's a CAMPO MTP and a DCHC MTP if you look at maps, but they are done regionally and displayed together in a lot of instances. We share a regional travel demand model that is also participated by DOT and Go Triangle as the Regional Transit Authority. We share population and job forecasts because, as you can imagine, those things don't change just because you have a county line in the middle. And we try to have consistent financial assumptions, consistent goals and objectives. We have consistent performance measures, but the targets we're trying to meet may be different between CAMPO and DCHC. And then we have projects and programs that will span both MPOs, like our TDM, our Travel Demand Management Program, and corridor studies and the commuter rail project and things that go between MPOs. We try to approach those in a joint fashion. The UPWP, again, is our annual budget and work tasks. So we divide our UPWP up into what we call core mission work and non-core mission work. The core mission work goes back to those 5 core duties that Chris discussed earlier. I will not quiz you on those, although I'm sure you took good notes and have them memorized. But we have 5 core things the MPO exists to accomplish. When we have work that is related to those 5 core things, we consider those core mission work tasks. We also have non-core mission work tasks. So a lot of these are things that our local government agencies will submit as special study requests during our call for projects every fall. I'll go over in a few minutes what we have in our existing and future work plans for those. But those generally require additional local match in order for the MPO to undertake those efforts. So our FY24 UPWP was adopted in February of this year. So this is for the work that is expected to start in July of this year and go through June of 2024. We have a couple of ongoing efforts. Our MTP bicycle and pedestrian element update is not necessarily drawing lines on the map that will be greenway and bike projects, but more looking at our data structures and how we can make our bicycle and pedestrian element more useful for you all to be able to use. We have just, or are still going through the procurement process for that. So that's going to start up here pretty soon. This is something that Alex and I both have been talking about for 10 years in a row. And finally, we're able to get some funding put into the UPWP for it. So we're excited for this project to move forward and hopefully be in place for our 2055 MTP. We also have the Fayetteville-Raleigh passenger rail study, phase 2. We did phase 1 of this study, I think in 2019, to look at passenger rail feasibility between Raleigh and Fayetteville. This was at the request of the Fayetteville MPO. We partnered with them and with NCDOT to do that study. There are 2 rail lines that you could feasibly use that already exist today to get between Fayetteville and Raleigh. We found that there's kind of trade-offs between using both of those things. So the study didn't really come up with a discrete recommendation for one versus the other. It came up with a list of here's the things that you'll have to give up if you use this rail line, and here's the things you'll have to do if you use this other one. So we wanted to move on to a phase 2 of that study, but in the meantime, NCDOT is currently doing a lot of passenger rail planning in the state. So we're waiting for outcomes of their studies before we see what else might need to be studied in this corridor before using our funding to study something that they may already be studying or may already figure out through their efforts. So that's kind of on hold. We've expected phase 2 to start this current year. We put funding in the UPWP for it to start next year, but it's kind of a wait and see what happens. We're continuing to monitor that. new studies that will be starting up in FY24, the locally coordinated human services transportation plan update. That is a required planning effort that is required in order to utilize certain federal transit funds. The MPO will be managing that because it is a regional plan. We're splitting the cost of that with Wake Transit funding, so that'll be kind of a shared funded plan. And it's meant to make sure that we are thinking regionally when we're talking about delivering kind of non-fixed route transportation services in the region. We have a regional multimodal safety plan programmed in FY24. This thing is huge. This is a huge, very ambitious effort that we're going to try to undertake. We're hoping that we're going to be able to meet the Safe Streets for All planning requirements for this so that the local government members within CAMPO can utilize this plan to obtain implementation funds. There's a lot of implementation funding available through the IIJA to do with safety, but you have to have a plan that meets the federal requirements in order to access those funds for implementation. So we're hopeful that it's going to do that. We're also hopeful that it is going to be able to look at our safety performance measures and targets, get some more data around those things, and maybe have some better tailored safety targets for the region beyond what NCDOT is currently using. And the public engagement requirements for that are just extensive. So that's going to be a big effort. It's going to be very involved. I'm sure maybe everybody here will be on some committee or another to help us guide that multimodal safety plan. It's also going to be meeting the federal safety planning requirements that the MPO has. There's specific PL dollars that are directed towards the TMA MPOs to be able to do safety planning. So we'll be meeting those requirements through that plan as well. It's probably going to take us 2.5 years to get through that plan. The Northwest Harnett County Transit Study, this was submitted to us as a special study request, but because we saw this as part of the transit element of our MTP, we're doing this as a core mission study, which means we're not having extra funding provided by Harnett County to do this work for them. We are going to be looking at how Northwest Harnett, which is growing at a very rapid clip, if you're not familiar, how they can plug into the Wake Transit system that exists in the southern part of the county, or how they might have their own transit network, whether microtransit might work. It's a pretty comprehensive transit study to figure out what transit opportunities might be feasible to connect that rapidly growing residential area into the job centers. The Wake Transit Plan update. You may be familiar with the Wake Transit Plan. Again, we're going to go into a little bit more detail on the Wake Transit program later on today. The Wake Transit Plan was originally adopted in 2016. It was the foundation for passing the transit sales tax in Wake County, and CAMPO is charged as lead agency with maintaining that Wake Transit Plan. It's been updated one time 2 years ago, and the update to it at that point was really just kind of reconsidering cost curves and project schedules to make sure we were still on track to deliver the things that we were planning to deliver in the Wake Transit Plan. This next update will be more comprehensive. We have a lot more BRT going to be on the ground here in short order, right, Het?
Yes.
A lot more BRT funded federally. We have the commuter rail project, which is going to have some decisions around it here in the next few months. So really kind of rethinking what and how we can deliver the Wake Transit visions, and the 4 big moves of the Wake Transit Plan need to be updated. So we're going to start that in fiscal year 24 as well. Another piece of Wake Transit, I don't want to steal the thunder of the Wake Transit team that are going to talk about this, but there's a community funding area element of that allows the local governments outside of Raleigh and Cary to access Wake Transit funding. for local planning projects or operational projects or capital projects. The program management plan for that has not been updated since the program was created back in 2016 or 2017. So we're just going to do an update to that program management plan next year. The Apex Rail Yard Relocation Study. If you're familiar with downtown Apex, there's a big old fat railroad running right through the middle of town with a switching yard and all. And Apex really sees that as kind of a hindrance to their pedestrian environment and their overall kind of downtown environment. We're going to try to help them navigate what it might look like to relocate that rail yard outside of downtown Apex. We've been talking with them about that for years and years, and so we're going to devote some funding and procure some consultant services to kind of help navigate that conversation and see what opportunities are available down there.
Shelby, I had a quick question about that.
Yeah.
I should have maybe asked this when we were talking with UPWP at TCC, but it didn't seem relevant. Is that a study that has an active or will have an active kind of stakeholder relationship that's positive with the railroad? I think it's CSX, if I'm not mistaken. Or is it kind of more future of what would we approach the road about maybe someday?
We're hopeful it's going to be the former. We're hopeful that it's going to have a more active relationship there, and especially with some of the things that DOT has been working on with the rail companies. We're still in the process of scoping that study and exactly what the deliverables and outcomes are going to be. I think it's going to be a lot of conversation-based work and a lot of negotiations, and some of that, you know, Apex has done some visioning for what they would like to see happen, but there's not really been any active buy-in on that from the rail side of things. So this is to kind of help navigate those conversations.
Thank you.
Morrisville Parkway Access Management Study. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that one just because we have an RFQ out on the street right now, and we try not to talk about active RFQs too much so as not to give anybody unfair advantage in replying to those things. But that's a pretty basic study looking at access management and facilitation of bicycle and pedestrian accommodation along a section of Morrisville Parkway in Morrisville. That's another, both the Morrisville and Apex projects are non-core mission studies that those towns will be helping to pay for, but CAMPO will be managing the studies. The Wake County Collector Street Plan, this actually has been removed from our UPWP. Wake County had considered updating their local collector street plan for the county during fiscal year 24. They've pushed that back, so they actually withdrew that request. But we were going to assist with that effort. And then the Triangle Bikeway NEPA and design project. You may be familiar with the Triangle Bikeway that CAMPO conducted a planning study based on early Wake County Greenway planning efforts that identified the potential for a bikeway between Raleigh and RTP. And our feasibility study we actually did jointly with DCHC MPO and carried it all the way out to Chapel Hill. But this NEPA and design project, the county and RTP have dedicated funding and requested that the MPO manage the NEPA and design for that Triangle Bikeway project in order to prepare it to be competitive for some federal funding, hopefully to get it constructed in the future. That's another giant project that we'll probably be hiring specific staff person to manage for us in the coming year. We have other ongoing programs here on the alphabet soup side of the slide. Every year we have to do things to maintain our MTP, whether it's making project modifications or doing full-on amendments like will be happening in the next few months, or having active pieces of the MTP underway. Our LAP program, again, Chandler's going to go over that in more detail in the future, but that's part of our UPWP. The maintenance of our TIP, every quarter we do amendments or modifications to our TIP to make sure that it's matching up with the things that we want to do through the LAP program or through the state TIP, and that we're being reflective of projects that are changing and evolving at NCDOT through the STIP. Our UPWP, we adopt that usually in February or March every year. It usually, because that's so early before the fiscal year actually starts, that usually also involves 1 or 2 updates throughout the year to true things up as things become more or less real moving through the year. The Wake Transit Plan Administration, again, we're going to have some more detailed information on the Wake Transit program, but we have a lot of responsibilities at the MPO as one of the lead agencies for the administration of Wake Transit on the planning end of things. We have a pretty comprehensive public engagement program. Not only do we do general MPO engagement, but also, engagement for our special studies, assist with engagement for other planning efforts, local planning efforts or partner agency efforts. We have a mobility coordination committee, which is actually an outfall of our last locally coordinated human services transportation plan. And that's a group comprised of our transit agencies, as well as our partners in human services transportation and human service agencies to continue working on coordination and making sure that those needs are being served efficiently and effectively in the region. The congestion management process is a thing that is required of TMA MPOs. So we do have a congestion management process requirement. In the past, we've done some pretty discrete congestion management, data collection and data reporting. We need to update that during this current year and the coming fiscal year as well. So some of that work will happen. Our travel demand model is a very extensive and robust tool that's used for our transportation planning throughout the entire Triangle region. And the Triangle travel demand model boundary actually goes out beyond the MPO boundaries for DCHC and CAMPO to a pretty far extent. And finally on this list, the transit coordination. I mentioned that federal dollars that are used for transportation planning have to be reflected in our UPWPs, so we do some coordination there with our transit partners. We also have some of those federally required performance measures that deal with transit, and so we have staff here at the MPO that helps to coordinate those transit performance measures and metrics with our transit partners.
I've got a quick question on the previous slide.
Yeah.
How do you determine what studies are managed by CAMPO versus what remain managed and overseen by the various agencies?
If CAMPO is putting money on them, CAMPO is managing them. We have on very rare occasions delegated money out or allocated money out to member governments for them to use on planning studies. But because our federal requirements tied to that money are so high and many, in order to maintain confidence that those are being met, we manage all the studies in our UPWP, which I think is a benefit to people submitting studies to us that they can have someone else manage and help pay for them. So again, just some other MPO programs for you to be aware of. The travel demand modeling, we have 2 full-time modelers on staff. DCHC has full-time modelers on staff. And this is a very robust program that's constantly looking at things and evaluating things and analyzing things for us on a variety of fronts. Transportation demand management, we have a pretty robust TDM program here in the Triangle. It's run through TJCOG. We fund that program with our CMAQ funding. DCHC partners with their CMAQ funding, and the state provides CMAQ funding as well. CMAQ funding is congestion mitigation and air quality funding that is federally allocated to us. Vision Zero, while this isn't a real defined program here at the MPO, it is an element of things that our board and our member agencies in recent years have been in favor of us including more Vision Zero kind of elements in our planning studies. That's going to be a big part of our big multimodal safety plan that we have coming up in fiscal year 24. We do have a Safe Routes to Schools program. That's a committee that meets, I want to say every other month. It might be quarterly, either quarterly or every other month. that looks at safe routes to schools issues. That is comprised mainly of TCC members and some people that are not on our TCC, but that are technical staff from member agencies or school systems that come to those meetings. They have recently engaged with NCDOT to do some road safety audits. That traditionally when DOT does road safety audits, they're just looking at car travel and car safety. So our Safe Routes to School program kind of piloted with NCDOT looking at pedestrian and vehicular safety in school areas. So they did one school in Garner or Fuquay-Varina, I'm forgetting right now, to do a comprehensive road safety audit that then had some discrete recommendations that the municipality could carry forward and implement, or that they could, submit for lap projects or figure out, how to get done. And some of those are also programmatic recommendations as well. I already mentioned the congestion management process. We also have something called the Council of Planning for US 1. This is a long-standing kind of committee that has been in place, I think, since 2009 for the US 1 corridor, kind of at 540 in North Raleigh, north to the Franklin County line, the Franklin-Vance County line. So it's all of Franklin County within CAMPO, and then Raleigh and Wake Forest in Wake County. This has been an ongoing effort to maintain the viability of the US 1 freeway project that came out of a corridor study that CAMPO did back in 2008. So the Council of Planning has all their member government agencies and NCDOT, and they've all signed a memorandum of understanding to bring forth development plans that are happening in the corridors to make sure that those development plans are not impeding the progress or impeding the viability of the US 1 freeway project. So this has kind of been a long-standing effort to tie together that land use and transportation planning in a very specific corridor. And we're kind of starting to see some of the successes of that effort as the US 1, the U5307 TIP project has gotten funded and has moved through design. There's a lot of things that are available to be done and that need to be done through that project that have been kind of set up by this Council of Planning work over the past 10 or 12 years. So I think that's a good success story, but also a good learning opportunity for if we do that in other areas on different approaches that might be taken to some of that work. We do have a MPO public participation plan. I mentioned we have a lot of engagement that happens. That engagement follows the rules that are in place, the federal rules that are mandated to be followed for public engagement, meeting notices, meeting accessibility and availability and that kind of thing. So that's all covered in our public participation plan, which is actually Bonnie is working on an update to that right now. So that'll come to the TCC in the next couple of months as well. And I mentioned our mobility coordination committee as well. So
I got a question that the last slide might be relevant for, and it came up, I noticed it earlier. There was a slide that Chris showed that had basically said that there are special committees and ad hoc committees, and then there are subcommittees of TCC. And it's not clear to me of some of these which are which, and the relevance of that distinction between a subcommittee of TCC or something that's not really a creature of TCC at all. Could you clarify that a little bit for us?
Maybe. So I think some of it's just how we talk about things, for one thing. But when you think about the executive board and subcommittees of the executive board, there's some rules around that because of meetings laws and things like that. The TCC has set up various, we have like a LAP committee. We have a TIP and MTP committee of the TCC, and we run those things in a pretty informal fashion. They don't have chairs, they don't have minutes or whatever. They're pretty much working groups to have you all help us do our work in concert with how you all want it done.
There's no formal actions taken at those levels.
Right, there's no like recommendations or anything like that. Now, when we do a planning study, we we don't form official subcommittees of the TCC. For instance, when we have the Southeast area study going on right now, we have a core technical team that's helping to guide the technical work of that Southeast area study. But it's not a formal subcommittee or anything of the TCC, and it's also not making formal recommendations. So there's a little bit of structure around some of this, and the notices required with some of this stuff in our public participation plan. But a lot of it is just kind of how it's evolved and how we talk about things. So there's not a real distinction between when something is called a subcommittee or something is called a work group or anything like that.
So a lot of times with the TIP, with the MTP, with SPOT or prioritization, I could easily give you a 45-minute agenda item during the TCC, right? But you may not want that much
Some
detail.
people have done that.
Some people have done the truth. So I can offer a working group meeting and we can really get into the details. We can set aside 2 hours to talk about transit scoring and SPOT, or we can talk about community vis land use scenarios for the MTP. And TCC members can come and participate, ask questions. We can get into all the details. It helps staff make sure that our presentations are geared towards the questions and the concerns that you all have, right? And so I'm giving you a valuable presentation come TCC day, but it also gives us an opportunity to have dialogue, again, without having to have a 6-hour TCC meeting. You know, so those that want that extra information can come to the subcommittee or working group level meeting, but otherwise I'm going to give you a higher level overview when we get to the TCC agenda. Hopefully, I've already answered most of your questions at the working group level. Does that make sense?
Mostly.
Okay.
The council, U.S. Combined Council Planning, we do make motions. We
Sorry.
are official, and
That's-
because of the memorandum of understanding.
Yeah,
correct?
that's a whole separate, that's not even called a subcommittee or anything like that. That's its own kind of entity, and it's administered by the MPO, which is set up in the bylaws of that group, that the MPO, that's why we normally have 2 people there. We have an administrator and we have somebody participating and voting on behalf of the MPO. So that was born out of that US 1 corridor study as a recommendation. And so it was set up with its own MOU that was signed by all the member governments and its own bylaws.
So as a, for instance, the Safe Routes to School, that's a TCC subcommittee?
Yeah,
Okay.
that started out as a bicycle pedestrian subcommittee. Many years, I mean, before I even started at CAMPO when God was a boy. And the kind of evolution of that has grown into this Safe Routes to School, or when we got specific Safe Routes to School funding allocated to the MPO several years ago, the group really shifted its focus to focus on those Safe Routes to Schools. And so they're kind of acting as the Safe Routes to School committee now, but it started out as that bicycle and pedestrian committee. So it's been kind of an evolution. And again, that's another one just of how you talk about it, because that, again, that group is not really making specific recommendations. They are doing their own work. They have work tasks that are outlined in the UPWP as far as what they're trying to accomplish each year, but they're not, formally reporting anything to the TCC.
And I guess one of the things I'm inferring is that it's an important part of particularly Bonnie's responsibility, that when something is kind of the more detailed conversation about what happens at TCC, to use Alex's example, that those meetings become public meetings where people can find a way to attend and participate. Otherwise, the public comes to TCC and it's like they talked about the most important thing ever for 30 seconds. What the heck's going on? Yep. And okay, that helps me understand a little better.
Yeah, and that's, that's part of just an ever evolving functionality of the MPO. I mean, there have been studies, again, not in a while, because our past 2 strategic plan updates, everybody has told us that they think the way we're doing things is working pretty well. But back in 2009, there was a pretty comprehensive organizational study done for the MPO to really look at, the formalness of some of those committees and how those working groups might be set up differently. And I think as our area and our member participation continues to evolve, if there's ways that you all think things can happen better or more meaningfully, or be delivered better or in a more meaningful way, we're always 100% of the time happy to listen to those things and try to adjust the way we do things to make it more responsive. the MPO region, I mean, it's a beast. It's huge. And so trying to meaningfully deliver the services that we're trying to deliver across the broad spectrum of member organizations that we have is just a continually evolving challenge. So we're always happy to hear if you have ideas on ways we can do that better, to better serve you all. Were there any other questions? Okay, so in addition to the funding that's included, that Chris kind of went over a little bit of this earlier on, but there's other funding mechanisms outside of delivering projects outside of our UPWP. Our UPWP is our internal budget, it's our planning budget, it's the work that the staff here is actually doing, and work that the staff is doing to help us participate and achieve success in these other kind of funding programs. So the statewide prioritization process is the way North Carolina goes about prioritizing things to make it into the state transportation improvement program. Alex is going to go into a greater level of detail on that, so you might want to get some more coffee. And our locally administered projects program.
Oh.
Many, many years ago, CAMPO had a process. A process is a generous word. CAMPO had a way of, whenever a new funding source popped up or a new program was available, we would put out a call and say, hey, who wants to use this money for something? Hey, who's got something to use this for? And our members were like, okay, just stop it. Can't we just do one, like once a year you ask us what we want out of, you know, the MPO, and you just tell us how you can fund it? And we were like, yeah, okay, that's a good idea. So we created the LAP program. We also created the LAP program because of that kind of haphazard way of doing things led to a $50 million rescission of DA funding because it wasn't being properly used, or the people who were supposed to be using it didn't understand that it was going to go away if they didn't use it in an appropriate timeline. So we created the LAP program, which is a very robust way that we have a competitive call for projects every year to allocate the funding that does come into the MPO for local transportation projects. And Chandler's going to talk more about that program in a few minutes. So that's all for me. Does anybody have any questions on that before we move into some of the SPOT and TIP details?
Very nuts and bolts question. Will we have access to this presentation afterwards?
Absolutely not. I'm just kidding. Yeah, we'll email it. We'll email it out, and Bonnie will also prepare a survey that will come out to you after this session as well, so you can take notes on things you think we're talking too much about, or things that you wish we would talk more about, or different things that we missed altogether that you're wondering about, to help us kind of evolve this program as we go along.
Thank you.
I'm going to stand up so I can see people and I tend to think better if I'm standing up. So statewide prioritization or SPOT, the first thing you'll hear us say SPOT, you'll hear prioritization, you'll hear P5, P6, P7, it's all the same thing. Gosh, 2010 sometime, maybe even earlier than that, I've got a slide on it. SPOT 1 came out, it was under Governor Perdue at the time. And everybody called it SPOT, and then at some point DOT we started calling it prioritization. All right, and so now you hear P5, P6 or whatever. So SPOT and prioritization, the same thing. The whole purpose of SPOT, which is great by the way, I am a huge fan of SPOT. The whole purpose of SPOT is to develop the state transportation improvement program, and to really appreciate how great SPOT is. You had to understand the chaos that was prior to SPOT, right? So prior to SPOT, you had MPOs and division engineers all across the state. You had legislatures, you had local elected officials all asking DOT to put money on various projects. And it led to this massive step where you might have a project with a few dollars in the last year of the tip, and it sort of just hung out there, and every 2 years a new tip would come out, and your project was still hanging out there on the tail end. It got to the point where we had a former DOT secretary who said, the State Transportation Improvement Program is the greatest work of fiction, because it was this massive document with billions of dollars, way over budget. There's no possible way we could deliver everything. And it got to the point where you couldn't figure out what realistically was going to move forward and what wasn't. But politically, we were able to get it passed because everybody had something in the STIP that they could be happy about. So, whoops, wrong button.
It's backwards. You have to pretend you're going backwards.
Oh, oops, okay. So, sorry. So just a couple. All right, we're going way back now. I hate this thing. Can you just go back 2 slides? Let me put this thing down and not deal with it. To the pie chart. So in any given STIP, we might have $7 to $10 billion worth of funding across the state. All the different funding categories that Chris mentioned earlier, but you can see just roughly for the current STIP, this is how the funding breaks down by mode across the state. So what SPOT does is we're going to score all of those different projects with quantitative scores, travel time savings, number of passengers, how many trains are going down that track every day, how many planes are leaving the airport, all the different modes to come up with technical scores to fairly evaluate the benefits of one project versus the next. So it's not a political contest or a beauty pageant. It is supposed to be real numbers. Next slide. So one of the reasons that this is so important to us, but looking at where the money has gone historically, folks are always arguing, I'm not getting enough money. I, being a town, being a county, being an MPO, a division, whoever, nobody is ever happy with the amount of money they've received in the past. You might have heard in the past North Carolina being called a donor state, that we give up so much federal gas tax every year, but we only get a smaller portion back. So this was our attempt at creating a donor counties. And so this analysis that we did, it's a little bit outdated, but the argument still holds, is the amount of revenue developed or generated at the county level compared to the amount of expenditures at the county level. And so the argument is, like, if you go out to Hyde County here, if you've ever been out to Hyde County and gone over like the Alligator River Bridge heading out to the Outer Banks, it's a huge bridge, it's extremely expensive. There's not a lot of population in that county. There's not a lot of revenue generated in that county. So one could argue they have actually received much larger expenditures per capita or per revenue source than other counties like Wake County you see here. So it's a little sunken down. It's not quite having the return. Also, when you get over to the mountains, if you've ever tried to build a road through the mountains and had to move rock, that's not a very cheap project either. So we try to keep track of that and show that even though you might have a couple, $1 million worth of projects in Wake County, when you compare that to the amount of revenue that's coming out of Wake County, we're still not seeing maybe an equitable share. The next slide. So I won't go through every item here on the TIP, but you've heard Chris and Shelby talk a little bit about the TIP versus the STIP. They are mirror images, or excuse me, mirror documents. So a project has to be in the TIP and the STIP, has to have the same scope, schedule, funding source. And if it doesn't move forward. So Jason, yes, you can't make DOT do a particular project by putting it in the TIP, but you can stop DOT from doing a particular project by not including it in the TIP. Make sense? So we had a former division engineer that used to say, we have the same size stick, right? We can't make somebody do something, but we can stop them from doing something. With SPOT, and not only does the TIP and the STIP have to match up, our TIP has to match up with our MTP. So recently we had an MTP amendment or a request to amend the MTP to widen I-40 from Crossroads Interchange to Lake Wheeler. And that's because our MTP says we're only going to allow 8 lanes on I-40, and the DOT project at Crossroads and from Crossroads to Lake Wheeler said we need to have 10 lanes basically with those auxiliary lanes. So we're going to make that amendment come August when we adopt our MTP, and that will allow that project to move forward. So again, TIP and STIP have to match, but TIP and MTP also have to match. Okay. So let me move on to the next slide. So SPOT, again, the purpose of SPOT is to get that political argument out and to actually have quantitative scoring of projects. Let me go on to the next slide. Should be 3 actions. Okay, well, here's a little bit of history. So again, 2009, SPOT 1 came out. We got to SPOT 2. SPOT 2 actually didn't go anywhere. It was another financial issue. And then around 2012, we get to the Strategic Transportation Investment Law, or STI. That changes SPOT because that did away with that equity formula. And it became to establishing how the different funding is cut up into different funding buckets, different competitions. SPOT 6, mentioned that at our meetings the last year and a half, has been canceled, and we'll start SPOT 7 this coming fall. The next slide, I believe, are the 3 actions. So for MPOs, when it comes to SPOT, we have 3 things that we do. And number 1 is we submit projects for scoring. It's in italics right now, 44 projects. That's actually probably going to go up to 46 projects. So we'll pick 46 roadway, 46 bike ped, 46 rail. It's always fun to try to come up with 46 ferry projects for CAMPO, but we can submit those. It's also hard to come up with that many aviation projects, right? And it's for all of CAMPO, right? Then, about 8 months later, we start looking at local priority points, and we get a number of points that'll be probably still at 2,500. I'll get to the different tiers here, but we'll have local input points that we can assign to those projects to increase their score. Sort of, what your priorities are. The division engineer also has points that they get to assign to projects. And then after all the scoring is done, our executive board will take an action and adopt the TIP, that is the results of those scores. So those are the 3 big steps that we take. We submit projects, we assign points, and we adopt the TIP. So the next slide, this is how the STI law works. So we start off with the entire budget of NCDOT, and it's going to be cut up into different tiers. So the first tier is called statewide mobility. So 40% of our funding is going to go over to this statewide mobility tier. 30% is going to go to the regional impact, and 30% is going to go to what's called division need tiers. Now, the interesting thing about the way this works is you see these little arrows connecting down to the different pots of money. A project in the statewide tier gets to compete for that funding. If it wins, and it goes into the STIP with those statewide funds, that project's over here. If it doesn't, it then gets to go down and cascade and compete for funding at the regional level. And if it gets scored there and it gets programmed, great. If it doesn't, it gets to take another drop down to the division needs. So the statewide tier gets 3 shots at being funded. Okay? The regional impact tier projects get 2 shots at being funded. And everything in the division pot of money has 1 chance to get funded. Make sense? Now let's talk about what's in each of those categories. Hold on, not done. Let me go back, sorry. So our statewide mobility tier are our interstates on the roadway side. There are also some NC and US routes. US 64, US 70, US 1 are all in the statewide tier. I'll come back to the other modes, but I'm going to continue on with roadway. At the regional impact tier are all the other NC and US routes. Okay? And then last, at the division needs tier, those are all your secondary roads. Okay? So I-40 in Wake County's got 3 chances to be funded: statewide, regional, and division. US 1, 64 the same way. Carytown Boulevard right out here in front of our office, 1 shot, division needs. You see where the priorities are? If you're the one writing this law, it's going to be on those statewide tier facilities, and then regional, and then division, right? Now, for the other modes in statewide tier, we have rail, So all our Class A railroads, so I can do all of our rail grade separations, those can come out of statewide. For regional, statewide is also RDU Airport, although they have a limit on how much money they can actually get. But the largest airports in the state, Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, are in the statewide tier. And then there's rail projects. At the regional impact, we can have transit. But the regional transit means it has to cross county lines and it has to serve more than one municipality. So I can run a BRT line from Fuquay-Varina to Wake Forest, and it's not regional. It has to compete at the division tier, right? But I can run a BRT line from one side of Morrisville, a couple miles down the road into Durham, and it's eligible for the regional funding. I didn't write the law, but that's how it works. Does it make sense? Not do you agree with it, but you understand some of the qualifications there. Sure.
Can you go over that one more time again? Because I thought you said across jurisdictions, but then you said from.
No, it has to go across county lines.
County lines, okay.
And serve more than one municipality.
Okay.
Right, so I can't go from, again, it has to get out of Wake County, right? And it can't just go from one side of Wake into Durham and all be within Raleigh. It'd have to cross into Durham, municipal, right? So the point is there are rules in the spot law. You don't have to learn all those today. That's why we're here, but it is a complicated process. Also at the regional level, you have more, your transit, you have more rail, you have all your other medium-sized airports, so your Jacksonville's and Wilmington's and other. And then at the division needs tier, all your secondary roads, that's all your bike ped. No bike ped anywhere but at that division needs tier, right? That's all your other transit, okay? I forget anything? That's enough? Okay, sorry.
Alex, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So bike ped, even if it's on a regional
Doesn't
scale,
matter.
okay, at all.
The only difference there, if I do a highway project and the bicycle pedestrian facilities are ancillary to that roadway project, yeah, then they get tacked onto roadway. But I could build a greenway from here to Charlotte and it still would have to be funded at multiple divisions.
Alex, I also have a question about the scoring. I understand from other meetings we've had that basically travel time savings drives the scoring, I think in all three more than anything else. But it's not clear to me if that is because of the legislature and what the laws say, or if it's more of a administrative rulemaking. I mean, to make an analogy to a federal process into the state government, if that can change based on DOT's approach.
The law defines some of the criteria that has to be used for roadway scoring. It does not define how those will be calculated. Okay, so it says travel time, forgive me, Jason, I can't remember. Safety has to be included. I believe economic development is included, but it doesn't say number of crashes per lane mile or anything like that. That's left to the department and the spot work group to figure out how they're going to create the scoring criteria, and that's adopted by the Board of Transportation every cycle.
And the spot work group is different staff within DOT.
The spot work group is a working group, so an advisory committee to DOT. It's made up of MPO and RPO representatives, League of Municipality, the Rural Center, I think the Association of County Commissioners, I think the COGS have a seat there, and I believe the remaining seats are from DOT. There might be some legislative staff who either, I don't know if they're voting members or they just sit in, but it is a large group. They meet a couple times a month for an entire year, every round of spot.
And I think you might have had this on a previous slide. In terms of the next round of spot in the schedule, have all of those methodology decisions already been made?
No.
That's ongoing.
Hopefully, Chris is actually on the work group. I believe he's hoping their last meeting will be in May. It could go as late as June, but we won't start drafting our project list until the rules are finalized because we might react differently given those rules.
Right.
As well as our
Do we
number of
have,
projects.
as an MPO, any sort of I guess, perspective on what we think those rules should be. And if so, is it appropriate to kind of describe that a little bit? And partly where I'm going, where my question is coming from, is that very aggressive performance target for safety that the state is not meeting.
Yes.
Is not reflected in its own prioritization rules. From my point of view, in the city of Raleigh, we should be scoring projects much more on safety benefit than just travel time savings. And I'd like to see that shifted somewhat, but I don't know if CAMPO is advocating for that, and if they are trying to, if that's being effective.
It's a good point. The safety folks from DOT are in the room. I don't know if they're technically voting members of the committee, but they are there. I'll have to check with the spot office and get back to you on that. Because for everybody advocating for one position, there are multiple people advocating for the other. So if I want to, we've had this in the past dealing with widenings. And I said, okay, how many points should I get for widening a road? Probably none. Because if I widen the road, I'm probably going to increase the travel speeds, which has a greater correlation to accidents and severity. From a safety perspective, I'm happy with everybody being stuck in traffic doing 10 miles an hour because nobody dies that way, right? But now if I'm a freeway engineer and I want to see a highway widened, we got to talk about that.
Right.
So it is not, there are not very good standalone safety competitions. It's more.
It's hard to model, that's really what you're getting at. It's easy to plug a project into a regional model or something like that and calculate or estimate travel time savings. It's a much harder to.
There aren't competitions for specific purposes. So it's not that we can score a safety project this way and a congestion project this way. We score roadway projects this way. And congestion is part of that score, safety is part of that score, freight is part of that score, so on and so on. Does that make sense? And so it's rare to get, we're getting into our spot discussion where we have a 3-hour discussion at lunch and learn on spot. So let's talk afterwards and let me move on.
Sure.
So let me get to the next slide, which should be my buckets of money. So the state, those three categories, statewide, obviously that's statewide. So we put an I-40 project in spot. It's competing with I-77, I-85, I-40 in Wilmington, I-40 in Asheville. All of those projects are being scored against each other. For the regional tiers, the regions are these different colors. They're paired NCDOT divisions. So CAMPO is in Region C and Region A. So let me pick a good project. NC 54 in Morrisville, right? Regional tier project competing with Durham and Fayetteville. NC 42 in Johnston County competes with Nags Head, Rocky Mount, Wilson, Goldsboro, has no competition in Wake County. Completely different funding pots, right? So we talk about NC 42 in Johnston County from 40 going back to Clayton, rock star of a project, scores great. NC 42 from 40 back to Fuquay Marina is a dog. Right? Because even though it might have higher traffic, even though its score might be higher than the portion in Johnston County, relative to its competition, it's got to go against 50, 54, all these other highways in Wake, Durham, and Fayetteville. You're not going to see that project get funded for a long time. Makes sense? So it's not just how high you score, it's who's your competition also. Next slide. And this is finally my different buckets, I believe. So there are 22 funding competitions in SPOT. There's the statewide, there's the 7 different regions, there's 14 different divisions, right? Statewide, this is 40% of your state budget. Regional, 30% of your state budget. But the amount in each bucket is based on population. So our Region C bucket is about $1 billion. Our Region A bucket might be 400 million, right? And then here's the kicker for us. Our division pots are all the same. So our population in Division 5, all of Wake and Durham County, whatever that population is, gets the same amount of money for all their secondary roads, all their transit, all their bike ped as Division 1 or Division 14 in the mountains. right? Yes, I didn't write the law, but that's the way it works, right? So can you understand why getting a bike ped project or a secondary road project in Division 5 is so much more difficult than getting a bike ped or a secondary road project maybe somewhere else in the state, right? We've got, the total scores range from a 0 to 100. A couple of years ago, we had a Greenway project, I think it was Apex to Cary, scored like a 92, didn't get funded. It's like, you get 50s programmed in other parts of the state. It gets worse. It gets worse. There are these things at the bottom here that we have to take into consideration and account for before we can start programming new projects. So you're going to have your maintenance, you're going to have your bridges, you're going to have your safety projects. Now, when we get over to the division pot, again, we've still got our bridges, we've still got our safety. Now you see that MPO direct attributable, right? So that means the money that CAMPO gets to go to our LAP program counts against the amount of money that Division 5 has for the division needs category, right? Not only CAMPO's direct attributable, but DCHC's money counts against that pot also. So you get down to like Charlotte, I think it's Division 10, right? This is like negative because Charlotte's got more DA money coming to them than is their equal share of the pot to begin with. So that makes it even more difficult to get secondary roads and bike ped and transit funded in Division 5.